You know how some houses just feel wrong? That's how it started for Ryan and Emma. They had just bought this old house on the edge of a thick, endless forest in Maine. It was a dream, really, a cozy escape from the noise of the city. The house itself was charming, with its wraparound porch and big windows overlooking the woods. But from the very first night, something wasn't right. It was late, and the couple was settling into bed when they heard it, a scream. Not just any scream, but something raw, guttural, like a person in agony. Ryan bolted upright, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Emma nodded, her face pale. They told themselves it was just an animal, maybe a fox. But deep down, they both knew it didn't sound like an animal. The next morning, Ryan decided to check the property line near the woods. He found nothing, no tracks, no signs of wildlife. But there was this eerie stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. Emma tried to laugh it off, saying they were just spooking themselves, but neither of them could shake the unease. The screams came again the next night, louder this time, and closer. Emma couldn't sleep. She kept staring out the window into the blackness of the forest, expecting to see someone, or something, watching. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and insisted they check it out. As they walked into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop. Every step felt heavier, like the forest itself didn't want them there. The flashlight beam sliced through the trees, but it didn't feel like enough. They called out, but no one answered. And then, just as they were about to head back, they saw it, a figure. Not quite human, standing just at the edge of the light. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. Ryan yelled, but the thing melted into the shadows as if it had never been there. They ran back to the house, locking every door and window. Emma was shaking, her voice barely a whisper. "We shouldn't have come here," she said. Ryan didn't argue. The next day, Ryan decided to ask around in town. He went to the local diner, hoping someone could explain what they'd heard, or seen. The waitress, an older woman with a tired face, froze when he mentioned the screams. "You bought the old Wilkins house, didn't you?" she asked. When Ryan nodded, the diner seemed to go silent. The waitress leaned in, her voice low. "That house, it's cursed. The last family that lived there, they disappeared. All of them. And before that, same story. People go missing out there in those woods." Ryan tried to laugh it off, but her words stuck with him. Back at the house, Emma had been digging through some old papers they'd found in the attic. There were photos, old newspaper clippings, and a leather-bound journal. The articles talked about disappearances, families, hikers, even search parties that ventured into the woods. "Ryan," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a house. Something is wrong with this place." That night, the screams didn't stop. They came in waves, louder and more desperate, echoing through the trees. Emma was terrified, tears streaming down her face as she begged Ryan not to go outside again. But he couldn't ignore it. He grabbed his flashlight and went to the porch, promising not to go far. The light barely pierced the darkness, and the sound of the screams was deafening. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was worse. Ryan turned to head back inside when he noticed something on the porch steps, a footprint. It was huge, not human, and smeared with what looked like blood. Emma was waiting by the door when he came back in, locking it behind him. "We're leaving," she said firmly, her voice shaking. Ryan didn't argue this time. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural. They packed bags and decided to leave first thing in the morning. Morning never came. At least, not the way they expected. They were jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud bang on the front door. It wasn't a knock, it was like someone, or something, was trying to break in. Ryan grabbed the fireplace poker while Emma hid in the bedroom, clutching her phone but finding no signal. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started. Ryan crept to the door and looked out through the peephole. Nothing. But when he opened the door, there was something on the porch, a small, bloody doll. It was old, its face cracked and its dress tattered, but its eyes seemed to follow him. Emma screamed when she saw it. "Get rid of it," she cried. Ryan threw the doll into the woods, but it didn't feel like enough. Something was playing with them, taunting them. And whatever it wasn't going to stop. Desperation set in. Ryan and Emma tried to leave that morning, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and the tires were slashed. Emma was panicking, pacing the living room while Ryan tried to figure out what to do. That's when they heard the scratching. It was coming from the walls, soft at first but growing louder. Ryan tore open a section of drywall, hoping to find an animal or explain the noise. Instead, he found something far worse. Tucked inside the wall cavity were bones, small, human bones. They were old, but unmistakable. Emma screamed, backing away from the wall. "We need to get out of here," she sobbed. Ryan nodded, his face pale. But how? They were trapped, and whatever was haunting this place wasn't going to let them go easily. The journal Emma had found in the attic became their only clue. It belonged to one of the previous owners, a man named Harold Wilkins. His entries started normal, descriptions of the house, the forest, his family. But as the pages went on, his writing became erratic. He wrote about the screams, the figure in the woods, and the same doll they had found on the porch. "They want us," one entry read. "They want all of us. The woods hunger." The last page was a frantic scrawl, "I buried them. I had to. It's the only way to keep them quiet." Ryan and Emma looked at each other, their faces pale. "What does he mean, buried them?" Emma whispered. Ryan didn't answer. But they both knew they had to find out. Armed with shovels and flashlights, they ventured into the woods, following the cryptic directions in Harold's journal. The air felt heavier with every step, the shadows deeper. It wasn't long before they found it, a clearing with a single, twisted tree at its center. The ground beneath the tree was disturbed, like something had been buried there. They started digging, the silence of the forest pressing down on them. It didn't take long to hit something solid. Ryan hesitated before uncovering it, a wooden box, old and rotting. Inside were more bones, along with another doll, identical to the one they had found on the porch. As soon as the box was opened, the air around them changed. The screams started again, louder than ever, and the ground began to shake. Ryan and Emma ran back to the house, the forest coming alive around them. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and the screams followed them, growing closer. By the time they reached the porch, Emma was sobbing, begging Ryan to leave the box behind. But the house wasn't safe either. The walls were shaking, the scratching sound now deafening. Ryan dropped the box on the kitchen table, his hands trembling. "We have to burn it," Emma said. Ryan nodded, grabbing matches and lighter fluid. As the flames consumed the box, the screams outside reached a fever pitch. The fire roared, and for a moment, it seemed like the nightmare might finally end. But then the lights in the house flickered, and the air turned ice cold. "It's not over," Ryan whispered. The next morning, The house was eerily quiet. The woods were still, the screams gone. But Ryan and Emma weren't relieved, they were terrified. The calm felt wrong, like the forest was waiting for something. They packed what they could and started walking down the road, leaving the car behind. But as they reached the edge of the property, Emma froze. "Ryan," she whispered, pointing to the porch. The doll was there, sitting upright, its cracked face turned toward them. Its eyes seemed to gleam, watching as they disappeared down the road. They didn't stop walking, but deep down, they knew the truth. You can leave the house, but the woods never let you go. You ever heard of Black Hollow? That abandoned mining town way out in the middle of nowhere? Yeah, the one with all the stories about people vanishing. A group of researchers thought it'd be a great idea to check it out. Typical curiosity, right? 5 of them, all eager to explore and debunk the rumors, packed their gear and drove out to the middle of the desert. The place was exactly what you'd imagine: dusty streets, rotting buildings, and this weird silence that made the whole town feel alive somehow. They parked their van near the old saloon and unloaded their equipment. Their leader, Dr. Kane, was this no-nonsense type who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. "It's just an old mining town," he said. "Probably dangerous structures, that's all." But the rest of them weren't so sure. As the sun started to set, one of them, Mia, noticed something strange. The shadows from the buildings seemed off. Longer than they should have been. Like they were reaching toward the group. She mentioned it, but everyone brushed her off. They should have listened. By nightfall, they set up camp in what used to be the town square. The plan was to stay the night, record any strange activity, and head back in the morning. Simple enough. They even joked about how cliché it all felt. But then the wind picked up. It wasn't just any wind, it carried this deep, echoing sound, almost like someone was humming a low, guttural tune. "Must be the mine shafts," Kane said, waving it off. But Mia was on edge. She swore she could hear something else, too, like footsteps crunching on gravel, circling them. They decided to explore a bit before turning in. The old saloon was their first stop. Inside, it smelled like rotten mold, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. That's when they saw it, a single mining helmet sitting on the bar, the lamp still faintly glowing. "That's impossible," whispered Mark, the youngest of the group. No one had been here for decades. The helmet freaked everyone out, but Kane insisted they stay. "Probably some urban explorer left it behind," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. They headed back to camp, but something was different. The fire they'd lit earlier was out, and their gear was scattered like someone, or something, had been through it. Sarah, the group's photographer, pointed to the ground. "Look," she said. "Footprints. Not just one or two, but dozens, all leading away from their camp and toward the entrance of the old mine." "No way I'm going in there," Mia said, her voice trembling. But Kane was already strapping on his headlamp. They followed the footprints reluctantly, the group sticking close together. The mine's entrance loomed ahead, a gaping black mouth that seemed to swallow the weak beam of their flashlights. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cold, it was bone deep, like the mine was pulling the warmth out of them. The deeper they went, the worse the air felt. It was heavy, stale, and carried that strange humming sound they'd heard earlier. Only now it was louder, almost like a voice trying to form words. "Let's just mark this and leave," Mia begged. But Kane pushed on. They found an old elevator shaft, rusted and broken. The tracks leading down disappeared into the darkness. Mark leaned over the edge, his flashlight scanning the walls. That's when they all saw it, carvings in the rock. Words, scratched deep, but in no language any of them recognized. "What the hell is this?" Sarah muttered. And then they heard it, a voice. Not from the mine, but from behind them. "You shouldn't be here," it growled, low and raspy. Spinning around, their lights caught a figure in the distance, just at the edge of the tunnel. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He wore old mining gear, his face obscured by shadows. But his eyes, they glowed. "Who's there?" Kane shouted, his voice echoing down the tunnel. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, watching. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. Mark swore under his breath. "I'm done. We need to leave." But as they made their way back to the entrance, something was wrong. The tunnel seemed longer, twisting in ways it hadn't before. Sarah checked her compass, but the needle spun wildly, useless. Panic set in. They were trapped, lost in a maze that shouldn't have existed. That's when the humming started again, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from one direction, it was everywhere. And then they saw them. Figures emerging from the walls, their faces hollow and empty, their bodies twisted like they'd been crushed. "Run!" Kane shouted, but where could they go? They bolted, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the narrow tunnel. The figures didn't follow, they didn't need to. The mine itself seemed alive, shifting and closing in on them. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, like veins carrying some dark energy. Finally, they stumbled into a large chamber. At its center was a massive, rusted mining cart filled with bones. Human bones. Sarah fell to her knees, trembling. This is where they went," she whispered. Kane stared in disbelief. "Who?" Mia asked, though she already knew the answer. "The miners," Kane said. "And anyone else who came here after." Before they could process it, the air in the chamber grew heavy. The glowing-eyed figure appeared again, standing just beyond the bones. "Leave," it growled. "Or join them." "All right, we're leaving," Kane shouted, backing away slowly. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed to the tunnel behind them. The group didn't need to be told twice. They ran, their breaths ragged, not daring to look back. The tunnel twisted and turned, disorienting them further. Mia tripped, falling hard onto the gravel. Mark stopped to help her, but when he looked up, his face went pale. "Where's Sarah?" he whispered. They all froze. She was gone. Kane cursed, spinning around with his flashlight. "Sarah! Sarah!" he yelled, but there was no response. The tunnel was empty, save for the faint hum that never stopped. It was as if the mine had swallowed her whole. Panic set in as they realized Sarah wasn't the only one missing. Their equipment bags and even their map of the mine had disappeared. It felt like the mine itself was stripping them of everything, one piece at a time. Kane tried to stay calm. "We need to stick together and keep moving. If we can find the entrance," but before he could finish, the ground beneath them shook violently. Rocks fell from the ceiling, and a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the tunnels. Mia grabbed Kane's arm, tears streaming down her face. "We're not getting out, are we?" she asked. Kane didn't answer. He couldn't. Hours, maybe minutes, passed. Time didn't seem to work right down there. They came across another chamber, this one filled with mining tools. But the tools were covered in blood, fresh and glistening. Mark picked up a pickaxe, his hand shaking. If it comes for us, I'm not going without a fight. But fighting wasn't an option. The glowing-eyed figure reappeared, closer this time, and with it came the others, those hollow, twisted miners. They moved slowly, deliberately, cutting off every exit. "Why are you doing this?" Cain shouted. The glowing figure tilted its head, almost curious. "The mine must be fed," it said. Its voice was layered, as if a dozen others were speaking through it. "You came here. You chose this." Cain made a decision. "Run," he told the others. "I'll distract them." Mia and Mark hesitated, but the look in his eyes left no room for argument. They sprinted down the nearest tunnel, Cain's shouts echoing behind them. The tunnels twisted again, but this time, they saw light, a faint, flickering glow ahead. They burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground outside the mine. The sun was rising, casting the town in an eerie orange light. But they were alone. Cain never came out. Neither did Sarah. As Mia and Mark stumbled back to the van, they glanced at the mine's entrance one last time. The glowing figure stood there, watching. And as they drove away, the humming followed them, a reminder that the mine never truly lets anyone go. So, picture this, Flight 217 from Denver to Seattle, just a routine 2-hour trip. The kind of flight you barely remember, right? But this one? No one who was on it could forget. I heard the story from a guy who claims he was there. It started like any other flight, smooth takeoff, chatty passengers, and the usual safety demo no one really listens to. About halfway into the flight, they hit turbulence. Not the mild, bumpy kind either, this was the sort that made your stomach flip. The captain came on, trying to keep everyone calm. "Just a bit of rough air, folks. Should smooth out shortly." But it didn't. The plane started shaking harder, and then someone noticed it, a massive storm ahead, with lightning streaking through the sky like veins. Thing is, this storm wasn't on the radar. The pilots hadn't seen it coming. And when they tried to steer around it, something went wrong. The instruments started acting up, altimeters spinning wildly, GPS failing. It was like the plane had flown into a different world. Inside the cabin, people were freaking out. The seatbelt sign was on, but the jolts were so violent, drinks spilled, and overhead bins popped open. A couple of passengers started praying. One guy swore he saw lightning strike the wing, but the weird thing? There wasn't any damage. Then, the lights flickered. Not just once, again and again, plunging the plane into this eerie, strobe-like darkness. The flight attendants tried to stay professional, but you could see the fear in their eyes. And that's when the first anomaly happened. A woman screamed. Everyone turned to see her pointing at the window. "There's something out there," she shouted. People craned their necks to look, but all they saw was the storm. Then, another scream came, this time from the back of the plane. A man stood frozen, staring at his phone. "I just got a text," he said, his voice shaking. "From my brother. He's been dead for 5 years." The captain tried to regain control, but nothing was working. The plane's altitude kept fluctuating, and they were flying blind. Then, the weirdest thing happened. The storm outside, it wasn't just black. It was shifting. Colors swirled in the clouds, unnatural and hypnotic, like something out of a nightmare. Passengers started seeing things. A kid cried out, saying there was someone in the aisle, but when the lights flickered on, the aisle was empty. A woman swore she heard her mother's voice whispering her name, even though her mother had passed away years ago. It wasn't just one or two people, it was everyone. Then came the drop. The plane plummeted, the kind of free fall that makes your heart slam into your throat. People screamed, clutching the armrests, but just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The plane leveled out, and the cabin went completely silent. When the turbulence stopped, everyone thought it was over. The captain announced they'd try to find a way out of the storm. But here's the thing, no one could tell if they were still moving. The clouds outside had turned into this dense, glowing mist that seemed to stretch on forever. The weirdness didn't stop. A passenger in first class, a businessman in his 40s, stood up and started shouting, "This isn't real. None of this is real." He stumbled into the aisle, and before anyone could stop him, he vanished. Like, 1 second he was there, and the next, gone. People screamed, but his seatbelt was still buckled. Panic spread fast. The flight attendants tried to calm everyone down, but then one of them, this young guy named Ethan, froze in the middle of the aisle. His face went pale, and he whispered, "Do you hear that?" No one else did at first, but then it started. A low, rhythmic tapping, like someone was walking on the fuselage. The tapping got louder, circling the cabin, moving from one side of the plane to the other. People pressed their faces to the windows, but the mist outside was too thick to see anything. Then, out of nowhere, the plane shuddered violently, like something had slammed into it. The captain came on the intercom again, his voice trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an unusual situation. Please remain in your seats." That didn't help. A man shouted, "Unusual? We're being attacked by what?" No one had an answer. The mist outside began to thin, but instead of clear skies, they saw something else, a mountain range, sharp and jagged, but glowing faintly, like it wasn't entirely solid. Someone recognized it as the Rockies, but they were way off course. And then came the worst part. The mountains were moving. Yeah, you heard me. Moving. The peaks shifted and twisted, almost like they were alive, or at least, aware. The whole plane went dead silent as everyone stared out the windows. And then the tapping stopped. But just as people started to relax, there was a sound no one could ignore, a voice. It came over the intercom, but it wasn't the captain or any of the crew. It was deep, distorted, and calm. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "Turn back." The cabin erupted into chaos. People screamed, others cried, and one guy tried to open the emergency exit, shouting, "We're going to die anyway." Thankfully, a couple of passengers tackled him before he could do it, but the damage was done. Fear took over, and no one trusted anyone anymore. Then, out of nowhere, the plane started climbing. Fast. Too fast. The engines roared, and people were thrown back into their seats. Someone yelled, "We're going to stall." But the climb didn't stop. It was like the plane was being dragged upward by something. As they ascended, the mist returned, thicker and brighter than before. People clutched at each other, some praying, others just staring into space. Mia, one of the flight attendants, whispered to Ethan, I think we're not in our world anymore." The mist finally cleared, and what they saw outside was impossible. The plane was above the storm, but the sky wasn't blue. It was this swirling, dark void, dotted with faint lights that weren't stars. It felt like they were floating in a space that wasn't meant for them. The captain's voice came back, shaky but determined. "We're going to attempt a descent. Buckle up." The passengers obeyed. though no one believed they'd actually make it. The plane tilted downward, and for a moment, it felt like they were falling into nothingness. As they descended, the storm returned, lightning flashing so close it felt like the plane would be torn apart. The weird thing? Some of the lightning didn't look natural. It was purple, green, and even red, and it seemed to move with purpose, almost like it was alive. Then, they saw it, a glowing rift in the clouds, like a tear in the fabric of reality. The captain aimed for it, his voice steady over the intercom. "We're going through. Hold on." The plane shook violently as it entered the rift, and for a moment, everything went black. When the passengers woke up, the plane was steady. The storm was gone, replaced by clear blue skies. The Rockies were below them, just as they should have been. People started to cheer, but their relief didn't last long. One by one, they realized something was wrong. Watches and phones showed different times, and the date on the in-flight screens was wrong, off by 20 years. Then they noticed the seats. Some were empty, though no one remembered anyone leaving. The businessman, the woman who screamed first, even Ethan the flight attendant, they were gone. The captain came on, his voice somber. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've made it through. But we don't know where, or when, we are. Air traffic control isn't responding, and the airport we were heading to doesn't seem to exist anymore." The plane circled for hours, burning through fuel, trying to find a place to land. Eventually, they spotted an airstrip, a small, abandoned one in the middle of the Rockies. It wasn't on any map, but they had no choice. As the plane touched down, the passengers noticed something strange. The airstrip looked old, like it hadn't been used in decades. The control tower was empty, and there were no other planes in sight. The captain told everyone to stay seated while the crew investigated. But when the doors opened, no one moved. Outside, the mist was waiting, swirling around the plane. And as the first passenger stepped out, they heard it again, that deep, distorted voice. "You shouldn't be here." So, a group of 6 college friends decided to hike the Appalachian Trail. You know how it goes. One of them, Kevin, was this outdoorsy type, always talking about disconnecting from the chaos and reconnecting with nature. The others? Not so much, but they were up for the adventure. It was supposed to be a week-long trip through the woods, camping under the stars. The first few days were perfect. Blue skies, crisp air, and nothing but the sound of leaves crunching under their boots. The trail was quiet, almost too quiet. They joked about how it felt like something out of a horror movie. "If we hear banjos, I'm out," Megan laughed, but you could tell she wasn't entirely kidding. On the third day, they stumbled upon an old, weathered sign nailed to a tree. The letters were almost illegible, but they managed to make out, "Turn back." Kevin, of course, brushed it off. "Just some prank," he said, leading the way forward. But the air around them felt heavier, like the forest itself was watching. That night, they set up camp in a small clearing. The trees loomed tall, their branches intertwining to block out the stars. The fire crackled, and they tried to keep the mood light with ghost stories. Emily, the skeptic of the group, rolled her eyes. "The scariest thing out here is Kevin's cooking," she joked, poking at the half-burnt hot dog on her stick. Around midnight, the first strange thing happened. Ryan, the quiet guy of the group, swore he saw something move beyond the firelight. A shadow, maybe, but it was too big to be an animal. "Probably just a deer," Kevin said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. As the others settled into their tents, Megan stayed awake, staring into the darkness. That's when she heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but deeper. She froze, gripping her flashlight. When she finally mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there. But the sound didn't leave her mind. The next day, the group pushed on, though the mood had shifted. The trail seemed different, narrower, darker, and less traveled. Kevin insisted they were on the right path, but even he seemed uneasy. The forest was dead silent, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. By afternoon, they came across something disturbing, an old, crumbling cabin hidden among the trees. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Against better judgment, they decided to check it out. The door creaked open, revealing a single room with rotting furniture and symbols carved into the walls. Strange, looping symbols none of them recognized. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Megan said, backing out. But before they could leave, Emily noticed something on the floor, a small pile of bones, maybe animal, but who could be sure? The group left in a hurry, the weight of the cabin pressing on them even after it disappeared from view. That evening, the tension was palpable. No one wanted to admit it, but they all felt it, something was wrong. They didn't bother with ghost stories this time. Instead, they sat around the fire in silence, listening to the forest, or rather, the lack of it. Just as they were about to turn in, Ryan noticed something. "Where's Kevin?" he asked, glancing around. Panic set in as they realized he was gone. They searched the campsite, calling his name, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Finally, they found him, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. "Kevin, what the hell are you doing?" Megan yelled, shaking his shoulder. He blinked, as if waking up from a trance, but all he could say was, "I heard it. Something calling me." The next day, Kevin was quieter than usual, and no one dared mention what had happened. They kept walking, hoping to find the next marked campsite, but the trail signs had vanished. It was like the forest had swallowed them. By midday, they came across another strange sight, a circle of stones, perfectly arranged in the middle of the path. At the center was a wooden effigy, crudely carved to resemble a human figure. "What the actual hell?" Emily muttered, taking a step back. Kevin, however, seemed drawn to it. "It's old," he said, reaching out to touch it. Before he could, Ryan grabbed his arm. "Don't. Let's just keep moving." They left the effigy behind, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. That night, the nightmares began. Megan woke up screaming, claiming she saw shadowy figures standing around the tents. Ryan admitted he'd dreamed of the cabin, only this time it was filled with people, or at least, what used to be people. The firewood they'd gathered wouldn't light, leaving them in near total darkness. They huddled together, too scared to sleep, listening to the sounds of the forest. For the first time, there was noise, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and that same low growl Megan had heard. Around dawn, they found something outside the tents. Footprints. But they weren't human. Whatever had been walking around their campsite had claws. By now, everyone wanted to leave, but they had no idea which way to go. The GPS on their phones wasn't working, and even Kevin admitted he was lost. "We'll just retrace our steps," he said, but the path behind them was gone. As they wandered, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The trees were twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. Emily tripped over something and screamed when she saw what it was, a human skull, half buried in the dirt. They didn't stick around to examine it. Panic set in, and they started running, desperate to find a way out. But no matter which direction they went, the forest never seemed to end. They eventually stumbled into another clearing, but this one was different. In the center stood a massive tree, its roots gnarled and exposed. Hanging from the branches were more of those wooden effigies, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. Kevin approached it, his face blank. "This is it," he said, almost in a trance. The others yelled for him to stop, but he didn't listen. As he touched the tree, the ground beneath them trembled, and a deafening roar filled the air. The shadows came next. Dozens of them, slithering out from the trees, their forms shifting and flickering. They surrounded the group, cutting off any chance of escape. One by one, the shadows closed in. Megan tried to run, but something grabbed her leg, pulling her into the darkness. Her screams echoed, then stopped abruptly. Emily and Ryan clung to each other, their flashlights flickering as the shadows circled closer. Kevin just stood there, staring at the tree. He started speaking in a language no one understood, his voice low and guttural. The shadows seemed to respond, retreating slightly, as if waiting for something. Then, the tree opened. Not like a door, it split down the middle, revealing a hollow filled with a pulsating, dark light. Kevin stepped inside without hesitation, and the tree closed around him. When the sun rose, only two remained, Emily and Ryan. They stumbled out of the forest, battered and broken, but alive. The police didn't believe their story. Search teams combed the area but found no trace of Kevin, Megan, or the others. Months later, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and at night, she swore she could hear that low growl outside her window. As for Ryan, he vanished a year to the day after the hike. The last thing he told anyone was that he was going back, to find Kevin, or to finish what had started. No one ever saw him again. You ever hear the stories about Lake Michigan? Most people think it's just another Great Lake, but there's this legend the locals won't stop whispering about. It starts with this group of fishermen, regular guys, out there for a weekend of fishing and beers. They didn't believe in curses or ghost stories, but they should have. It was late spring when it happened, the kind of day where the lake looks like glass. The group, led by Tom, the oldest and most experienced of the bunch, set out early in the morning. Along with him were his younger brother Mike, their cousin Paul, and a new guy named Eric, who was tagging along for the first time. They'd rented a small motorboat and headed to a secluded part of the lake, far from the usual tourist spots. By noon, the fish weren't biting. Frustrated, Tom decided they should try their luck near a rocky outcrop locals called the Devil's Teeth. The name didn't scare them, if anything, it sounded like a lucky spot. But the moment they anchored, things felt off. The water was too still, and the air seemed heavier. Paul was the one who found it. While casting his line, his lure got tangled in something underwater. After a few tugs, he reeled in what looked like a piece of jewelry, a heavy, tarnished amulet with strange symbols carved into it. It was cold to the touch, even in the warm sun. "What is that? Pirate treasure?" Eric joked, but Paul didn't laugh. He held the amulet up, squinting at the symbols. "Looks ancient. Maybe Native American?" Tom, ever the practical one, shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Throw it back. It's probably bad luck." But Paul didn't listen. Instead, he tucked it into his jacket pocket, grinning like he'd just struck gold. That's when the wind picked up, sudden and sharp. The boat rocked, and the water, which had been eerily calm, started to ripple with unnatural patterns. Mike, the superstitious one, muttered, "I don't like this." let's get out of here." Tom reluctantly agreed, and they started the engine. But as they tried to leave, the motor sputtered and died. "What the hell?" Tom said, yanking the starter cord again and again. The motor was brand new, but it wouldn't start. The wind grew stronger, howling across the lake, and the sky darkened even though it was only mid-afternoon. Eric pointed to the horizon. "Guys, that's a storm. We need to move now." The others grabbed the oars and began rowing, but it was like the boat wasn't moving. The harder they rowed, the more it felt like the lake itself was holding them in place. That's when Paul started acting weird. He kept glancing over his shoulder, mumbling under his breath. When Mike asked him what was wrong, Paul said, "Do you hear it? The whispers?" No one else heard anything, but the look in his eyes made the hairs on their necks stand up. As the storm closed in, the lake turned violent. Waves rose out of nowhere, slamming against the boat. Water splashed over the sides, and the wind was so loud they could barely hear each other. But even through the chaos, Paul wouldn't let go of the amulet. Then it happened. A massive wave hit them, tipping the boat sideways. Paul lost his balance and fell overboard, disappearing into the dark water. "Paul!" Tom screamed, diving in after him. Mike and Eric scrambled to keep the boat steady, but the waves were relentless. Tom surfaced a few seconds later, gasping for air. "He's gone," he shouted, his voice breaking. But before they could process what he'd said, the water around the boat went still. Completely still, like the storm had never happened. And that's when they saw it, a figure standing on the rocky outcrop, silhouetted against the dark sky. The figure was too far to make out clearly, but it wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching. "Is that Paul?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. But deep down, they all knew it wasn't. The air around them felt wrong, like the kind of silence that comes before a scream. The motor suddenly roared to life on its own, startling them. "Get us out of here!" Mike yelled, and Tom didn't hesitate. He steered the boat away from the rocks, but no matter how far they went, the figure remained visible, always at the edge of the horizon. When they finally reached the dock, it was dusk. Exhausted and shaken, they dragged the boat ashore. Mike turned to Tom and said, "We need to tell someone. The police, the Coast Guard, anyone." But Tom just shook his head. "And say what? That the lake swallowed Paul and spit out a ghost?" They didn't tell anyone. Instead, they agreed to head back out the next day to search for Paul. But when morning came, Eric was gone. His car was still parked at the dock, but there was no sign of him. His phone went straight to voicemail, and his fishing gear was untouched. Tom and Mike reluctantly got back on the boat. They spent hours scouring the lake, calling Paul's name, but there was nothing. No body, no wreckage, not even the amulet. By afternoon, they gave up and returned to shore, only to find 2 sheriff's deputies waiting for them. "You boys been out on the lake?" one of them asked. Tom hesitated, then nodded. The deputy sighed. "We got a report of an abandoned boat near Devil's Teeth this morning. Thought it might be yours." Tom's stomach dropped. "Did you find anyone?" The deputy shook his head. "Just the boat. And this." He held up the amulet. Mike recoiled when he saw it. "Get rid of it. Burn it. Whatever it takes." The deputy raised an eyebrow but said nothing, slipping the amulet into an evidence bag. As they drove away, Tom turned to Mike. "You think this is over?" Mike didn't answer. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Paul's face, pale and distorted, staring up at him from the water. Around midnight, he heard a noise outside, like footsteps crunching on gravel. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. At first, there was nothing. But then he saw them, wet footprints leading from the dock to his front door. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. Tom backed inside, locking the door and grabbing his phone to call Mike. Mike didn't answer. Tom tried again, then decided to drive over to his house. When he got there, the lights were off, and the door was ajar. "Mike," he called, stepping inside. The place was a mess, furniture overturned, pictures shattered on the floor. But there was no sign of Mike. He found one thing, though, the amulet, sitting on the kitchen table. It wasn't in an evidence bag anymore, and the symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Tom didn't touch it. Instead, he grabbed a dish towel, wrapped it up, and took it with him. By now, he was desperate. He drove to the nearest library and started researching the lake's history. What he found chilled him to the bone. Stories of disappearances dating back centuries, all centered around the same area of the lake. And in every story, there was mention of an artifact, a cursed object tied to the water. Tom decided to destroy the amulet. He took it to an old quarry on the edge of town, a place where he used to hang out as a kid. He built a fire and tossed the amulet into the flames, but it didn't burn. Instead, the fire died out, like the amulet was sucking the life out of it. Then, he heard it, the whispers Paul had mentioned. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, coming from all directions. Tom spun around, flashlight in hand, but he couldn't see anything. And then he saw them, shadows rising from the ground, taking shape. One of them stepped forward, and Tom's heart stopped. It was Paul, or at least, something that looked like him. "You can't break the curse," Paul said, his voice hollow. "It's part of the lake now. And so are we." Tom ran. He didn't stop until he reached his car, speeding away from the quarry without looking back. But when he got home, the amulet was waiting for him, sitting on his porch like it had never left. He knew then that there was no escape. The lake had chosen him, just like it had chosen Paul, Mike, and Eric. And it wouldn't stop until it took him too. The next morning, his boat was found drifting near Devil's Teeth, empty. No one ever saw Tom again. The amulet? It's still out there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to pull it from the water. You know how people say New Orleans has secrets? Not just the kind you find in history books, but the kind that send chills down your spine? That's exactly what happened to Ellie. She wasn't looking for trouble, she was just trying to learn about her family. Ellie had always been curious about her roots. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about New Orleans, about the vibrant culture, the music, and the magic that seemed to cling to the air. But there was always something her grandmother wouldn't say, something she left out. When Ellie turned 22, she decided to go down there and find out for herself. She booked a room in a little bed and breakfast on the edge of the French Quarter. The place was old, creaky floors, heavy drapes, the kind of vibe that felt like stepping back in time. Her first night was uneventful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next morning, Ellie headed to the local archives. She'd found an old letter in her grandmother's belongings, written in French, mentioning a woman named Lisette. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. The librarian, a kind old man named Mr. Dupree, helped her dig through records. After hours of searching, they found a mention of Lisette in a will from 1853. She had been a housemaid for a wealthy family, but there was no mention of what happened to her after that. Before Ellie left, Mr. Dupree hesitated. "If you're looking into Lizette, be careful," he said, almost in a whisper. "There are stories about her. Dark ones." Ellie brushed it off. She wasn't superstitious. But as she walked back to her room, she noticed shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The air in her room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest. Around midnight, she heard it, a soft humming, like a lullaby, coming from the corner of her room. She turned on the lamp, but there was nothing there. The humming stopped, but the room felt colder. Ellie told herself it was just her imagination and buried herself under the blankets. But as she drifted off, she heard a whisper, faint but clear, "Lizette." Her eyes flew open, but the room was silent again. The next morning, she found a small bundle of dried herbs tied with twine on her doorstep. She asked the innkeeper about it, but the woman just shrugged. "It's for protection," she said cryptically. Ellie didn't know what to make of it, but she kept the bundle anyway. Determined to learn more, Ellie visited a small voodoo shop she'd seen on her way to the archives. The place was packed with candles, charms, and strange bottles filled with things she didn't recognize. The owner, a woman named Maman Therese, seemed to know why Ellie was there before she even said a word. "You're looking for Lizette," Maman Therese said, her voice low and melodic. Ellie nodded, surprised. She was wronged. Betrayed by those she trusted. Her spirit is restless. The woman handed Ellie a small vial filled with a red liquid. "If you want answers, you'll need this. But be warned, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." That night, Ellie followed Maman Therese's instructions. She poured the liquid in a circle on the floor and lit a candle in the center. As the flame flickered, the air in the room grew colder. And then, she saw her, a figure in the mirror, staring back at her. The figure was a woman, her face pale and shadowed. She wore a tattered dress, and her eyes were full of sorrow. "Lizette?" Ellie whispered. The figure nodded, but her lips didn't move. Instead, Ellie heard her voice in her mind. "They took everything from me," the voice said. "My life, my love, my freedom. They buried the truth with my body, but the curse lives on." Ellie's heart pounded. "What curse?" she asked. But before she could get an answer, the figure vanished, and the candle went out. The next morning, Ellie went back to the archives. She found a newspaper article about a servant named Lizette who had been accused of witchcraft and hanged. But the story didn't add up. There was no evidence, just the word of her employers. The article mentioned that her body had been buried in an unmarked grave. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she had to find the grave. With Maman Therese's help, she tracked down an old cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The place was overgrown and abandoned, the kind of place you wouldn't want to be after dark. As Ellie searched, she felt like she was being watched. Shadows shifted in the corners of her vision, and the air grew colder with every step. Finally, she found it, a patch of ground marked only by a crude wooden cross. She knelt down, unsure of what to do next. "Speak to her," Maman Therese had said. So Ellie did. She told Lizette she was sorry for what had happened to her, that she wanted to help. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. That night, Ellie dreamed of Lizette. In the dream, she saw the events that had led to her death. Lizette had been in love with the son of her employer, a forbidden romance that ended in betrayal. When their affair was discovered, The family accused her of witchcraft to save their reputation. Ellie woke up gasping, her heart racing. She felt an overwhelming sense of injustice, like she needed to make things right. But how? She went back to Maman Therese, who gave her one final piece of advice: the truth must be revealed. Only then will her spirit rest. Ellie decided to confront the descendants of the family who had wronged Lisette. She found their address in an old directory and showed up at their grand, ivy-covered mansion. An elderly woman answered the door, her eyes narrowing when Ellie mentioned Lisette. "You shouldn't be digging up the past," the woman said, her voice cold. But Ellie refused to back down. She told the woman everything she had learned, about the betrayal, the false accusations, and the restless spirit. The woman's face paled. "We don't speak of her," she said. "It's a curse on our family, one that's haunted us for generations." Ellie realized that the family had been living in fear, but they had done nothing to make amends. She demanded that they acknowledge the truth publicly. Reluctantly, the woman agreed. She handed Ellie a key to an old chest in the attic, where she said there were letters that could prove Lisette's innocence. Ellie took the key and made her way upstairs, the air growing colder with every step. The attic was dark and musty, filled with boxes and forgotten furniture. Ellie found the chest in the corner, its lock rusted but still functional. Inside, she found the letters, love letters between Lisette and the son of the family, proof of their relationship and of her innocence. As she read them, the room grew even colder. Ellie turned to see Lisette's figure standing in the corner, her expression softer than before. "Thank you," the spirit whispered, her voice echoing in Ellie's mind. But then, the attic door slammed shut, and the air filled with whispers. Ellie realized that the curse wasn't just on Lisette. It was on the family, on the house, on anyone who tried to uncover the truth. The whispers grew louder, and shadows began to close in around her. Ellie barely made it out of the attic. She ran down the stairs and out of the house, clutching the letters to her chest. She didn't stop until she reached Maman Therese's shop, where she handed over the letters. "It's done," Ellie said, her voice trembling. Maman Therese nodded. "You've set her free, but the curse doesn't end so easily. It's tied to this place, to the greed and hatred that created it." Ellie left New Orleans the next day, the weight of the experience heavy on her shoulders. But even now, she can't shake the feeling that something followed her. Sometimes, late at night, she hears whispers in the dark, and the air grows cold. She wonders if Lisette's spirit is truly at rest, or if the curse has found a new victim. You ever hear those stories about truckers who just vanish on long hauls? I always thought they were just campfire tales, something to pass the time on lonely roads. But then there's this guy I knew, Ray. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but one trip down an old highway in Texas changed everything for him. It started like any other haul. Ray had a delivery scheduled from Dallas to El Paso. Simple route, right? But somewhere outside of Midland, his GPS started acting up. The map glitched, and before he knew it, he was on this narrow, deserted stretch of highway. No signs, no traffic, nothing. Just an endless road surrounded by flat, empty land. Ray didn't think much of it at first. He figured it was just a shortcut. But the longer he drove, the stranger things got. The air seemed heavier, and the silence was deafening. No birds, no crickets, not even the hum of distant power lines. Just the low rumble of his truck and the faint whisper of the wind. About 20 miles in, Ray noticed something odd in his mirrors. It was subtle at first, like a flicker of movement just on the edge of his vision. He'd glance back, but nothing was there. He told himself it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. Then his CB radio crackled to life. That wouldn't have been strange, except he hadn't touched it in hours, and the channel was supposed to be dead. The static was broken by a faint voice, barely audible, "Don't stop. Keep going." Ray grabbed the mic, but before he could respond, the line went dead again. He was starting to feel uneasy. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and his truck's clock wasn't making sense. 1 minute it was 3:15, the next it jumped to 3:47. His fuel gauge, which had been full when he started, was dropping faster than it should have been. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Ray was officially freaked out. The sky turned a deep, unnatural shade of red, like a warning. The road ahead was pitch black, except for the narrow beam of his headlights. That's when he saw it, something in the middle of the road. At first, he thought it was a deer, but as he got closer, it looked wrong. The shape was hunched over, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Ray slammed on the brakes, but when his truck skidded to a stop, there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching into the dark. Shaking, Ray took a deep breath and started driving again. But now, every mile felt heavier, like something was pulling at him, urging him to turn back. The air inside the cab grew colder, and his breath fogged up the windshield. Ray decided to stop and get his bearings. He pulled over and turned off the engine, but as soon as he did, the silence pressed in on him like a weight. He stepped out of the truck, and the first thing he noticed was how wrong the air felt, thick, almost suffocating. He looked around with his flashlight, but there was nothing, just the empty road and flat land stretching out in every direction. But then he heard it, faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind him. Ray whipped around, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling didn't go away. It was like something was watching him, just out of sight. He jumped back into the truck and locked the doors, his heart pounding. Back on the road, Ray noticed the headlights behind him. They appeared out of nowhere, glowing like twin yellow eyes in the dark. He figured it was another trucker, and for a moment, he felt relief. But when he slowed down to let them pass, the lights disappeared. Minutes later, the lights reappeared, this time much closer. Ray could feel his pulse racing as he pressed on the gas. No matter how fast he went, the lights stayed right on his tail, never getting closer but never falling behind either. Then his engine started sputtering, and the truck began to lose speed. Ray gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. The headlights behind him flared brightly, and his entire cab filled with an unnatural light. And just like that, his engine roared back to life, and the lights vanished. Ray's hands were trembling as he drove. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone on this road, that something was toying with him. The voice on the CB returned, clearer this time, "It's coming. Don't stop." The road ahead seemed to ripple, like heat waves in the distance, but it was cold. Ray turned on his high beams and saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. This time, it didn't vanish. It just stood there, tall and motionless, its face obscured by shadow. Ray swerved to avoid it, and the truck nearly tipped over. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the figure again, this time closer, running after him. But it wasn't running like a person, it moved too fast, too fluidly, like it didn't belong in this world. The road began to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Ray felt like he was driving in circles, but the odometer kept climbing. He checked his phone for GPS, but the screen was nothing but static. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, the figure was standing directly in front of the truck. Its face was finally visible, and Ray wished he hadn't seen it. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. Ray screamed too and jerked the wheel. The truck skidded off the road, crashing into a ditch. He sat there, shaking, as the figure slowly approached. But before it reached him, it stopped, its head tilting as if listening to something. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. Ray got the truck back on the road, though every instinct told him to turn around. But something about the road wouldn't let him. It was like an invisible force was pulling him forward, mile after mile. The CB crackled again. This time, the voice was clearer, more urgent. "It's too late. You're part of it now." Ray shouted into the mic, demanding answers, but all he got was static. Then the laughter started, low and guttural, echoing through the cab. He slammed the radio off and gripped the wheel tighter. He could feel the presence in the truck now, a weight pressing down on his chest. He glanced at the passenger seat and nearly drove off the road. There was an outline of a figure, faint but unmistakable, sitting right next to him. Ray's fuel gauge was dangerously low, but the road showed no signs of ending. He hadn't seen another vehicle, another building, not even a road sign, in what felt like hours. He was trapped, and he knew it. The figure beside him turned its head, its hollow eyes staring right into his soul. "You should have turned back," it whispered, its voice like gravel. Ray tried to ignore it, but the air grew colder, and frost began forming on the inside of the windshield. Ahead, Ray saw lights, bright, welcoming, like a gas station. He pushed the truck as fast as it would go, desperate for safety. But as he approached, the lights blinked out, one by one, until there was nothing but darkness. Ray didn't remember stopping, but suddenly the truck was still. The engine was off, and the road was silent again. He stepped out, his legs shaky, and realized he was back at the same spot where he'd first gotten lost. But something was different. The air was thick with the stench of burning rubber and decay. The road behind him was gone, replaced by endless desert. The figure was back, standing in the distance, watching him. Ray climbed back into his truck and started driving, knowing deep down that he'd never leave this road. The last thing he heard before the CB went silent forever was the voice, soft and final, "Welcome home." You know how Detroit has this reputation for being gritty, raw, and full of stories you don't want to hear after dark? Well, this one takes the cake. It started with these murders, gruesome, almost ritualistic. The victims were found in abandoned buildings, deep in the heart of the city. And get this, every single one had these weird markings on their bodies, like scratches or burns, but nothing anyone could explain. Detective Marcus Kane got assigned to the case. He's one of those old school types, gruff, sharp, but with enough baggage to weigh down a plane. From the start, Marcus knew something was off. The crime scenes didn't make sense. No fingerprints, no shoe prints, no DNA, nothing. Except for one thing, these massive, claw-like tracks leading away from the bodies. At first, people thought it was some kind of sick joke. Maybe the killer was using tools to mimic animal prints. But Marcus wasn't so sure. The tracks were deep, too heavy for any normal person to make, and they didn't lead anywhere logical. It was like whoever, or whatever, made them just disappeared into thin air. The first victim was a construction worker found in an old warehouse on the east side. His coworkers said he was a tough guy, not the type to scare easily. But the way they found him? His face was twisted in pure terror, his hands clawed at his chest like he'd seen something he couldn't handle. The second was a woman, a journalist investigating urban legends around Detroit. Her body was discovered in an alley, her recorder smashed to bits next to her. The audio file was corrupted, but Marcus's tech guy managed to pull a fragment. All it had was heavy breathing and this low, guttural growl that sent shivers down everyone's spine. By the third murder, people were panicking. Rumors spread fast in a city like Detroit. Some said it was a wild animal loose in the streets, others whispered about demons or curses. Marcus hated that kind of talk, but he couldn't deny the evidence was unusual. One night, Marcus was called to another scene. An artist who worked out of an old loft downtown had been torn apart, his studio wrecked. This time, there was something new, a smudge on the wall that looked like a handprint. But it wasn't a human hand. The fingers were too long, the palm too wide, and the texture looked like scales. Marcus took the print to the lab, but the results came back inconclusive. The tech said it wasn't human or animal, it was something else entirely. That's when Marcus started losing sleep. He'd sit in his dark apartment, staring at the case files, trying to connect the dots. But every lead ended in the same place, nowhere. Then came the dreams. Marcus started seeing the victims in his sleep, their faces frozen in fear, their mouths moving like they were trying to warn him. But the worst part was the shadow, this hulking, twisted figure that loomed in the background, watching him. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, feeling like someone, or something, was in the room with him. Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed something was wrong. His partner, a rookie named Kelly, said she felt like they were being followed. At first, Marcus brushed it off, but then he started noticing it too. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, faint sounds just beyond his hearing. One night, while they were staking out an abandoned factory, Kelly swore she saw something. It was just a flash, a glimpse of something big and fast darting between the buildings. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and followed her, but by the time they got there, it was gone. The only thing left was a faint metallic smell, like blood and rust. The next day, Marcus found a note on his windshield. It wasn't signed, but it said, "Stop looking. You don't want to find it." He showed it to Kelly, but she shrugged it off. "Just some nut trying to scare us," she said. Marcus wasn't so sure. Things escalated quickly after that. The murders got more frequent, the kills more brutal. And each time, the claw marks grew deeper, the handprints more defined. It was like the killer, or whatever it was getting bolder. Then came the night Marcus got too close. He was driving home when his car stalled on a back road. At first, he thought it was just bad luck, but then he heard it, the same low growl from the audio recording. His blood ran cold as he stepped out of the car, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when he saw the eyes. Two glowing orbs, too high off the ground to belong to any animal. They watched him from the shadows, unblinking. Marcus froze, his hand on his gun, but before he could react, the thing let out a deafening roar and vanished into the night. The encounter left Marcus shaken. He reported it to his captain, but no one believed him. They thought he was cracking under the pressure. Even Kelly seemed skeptical, though she didn't say it outright. Marcus decided to go it alone. He started digging into local legends, old police reports, anything that could give him a clue. That's when he found something chilling. Decades ago, there were similar murders, same claw marks, same strange handprints. The cases were never solved, and the files were quietly buried. One name kept popping up, the Shadow Beast. It was a story parents told their kids to keep them from wandering the streets at night. But the descriptions matched too closely to ignore. Marcus didn't believe in monsters, but he couldn't deny the pattern. Marcus decided to stake out the area where most of the murders had happened. He camped out in his car, armed with a shotgun and a growing sense of dread. The hours dragged on, the city quiet and still, until just after midnight. That's when he saw it. The figure was massive, hunched, and impossibly fast. It moved like smoke, darting between buildings with an unnatural grace. Marcus grabbed his camera, snapping a picture just as the thing turned towards him. The flash lit up its face, a twisted, monstrous blend of human and animal features. Before Marcus could process what he'd seen, the thing charged. He barely had time to react, firing off a shot that missed completely. The creature slammed into his car, denting the hood before vanishing into the shadows. Marcus sat there, shaking, his heart racing. He'd finally seen it, but he wished he hadn't. The photo Marcus took was blurry, but it was enough. He showed it to Kelly, who finally believed him. Together, they pieced together what they could. The creature wasn't just killing, it was hunting, picking its victims with precision. They set a trap, using an abandoned building as bait. Marcus and Kelly waited in silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. Hours passed with nothing, and then, just as they were about to give up, the thing appeared. It moved through the building like it owned the place, its claws scraping against the walls. Marcus held his breath, his finger on the trigger. But before he could fire, the creature turned and looked directly at him. It didn't attack. Instead, it smiled, a horrific, knowing grin that chilled him to the bone. The creature disappeared before they could catch it, but it left something behind, a piece of fabric caught on a nail. It wasn't cloth, though, it was skin, leathery and cold to the touch. Marcus sent it to the lab, but the results only deepened the mystery. The sample didn't match anything in their database. It wasn't human, animal, or even synthetic. The tech described it as organic, but wrong. That's when Marcus realized they weren't dealing with a serial killer. This thing wasn't human at all. Kelly wanted to go to the press, but Marcus stopped her. He knew no one would believe them, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter. This thing wasn't something you could catch or kill. It was something you survived, if you were lucky. The murders stopped after that, as suddenly as they began. The city moved on, but Marcus couldn't. He quit the force a few months later, haunted by what he'd seen. Kelly stayed, but they never talked about it again. Every now and then, Marcus checks the news, looking for signs that the creature has resurfaced. Deep down, he knows it's only a matter of time. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done. It was just waiting. And when the murders start again, Marcus knows he'll be the first to know. Because late at night, when he's alone, he still hears it, the low, guttural growl that reminds him he's not safe. None of us are. Okay, so you know how some places just feel wrong? Like the air's heavy, and every instinct screams at you to get out? That's what this motel was like. Sam and Lucy were on a road trip, trying to make it to their cousin's wedding in Arizona. They'd been driving all day, and when they saw the flickering vacancy sign, they decided to stop for the night. The place looked ancient. Paint was peeling off the walls, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. But it was late, and they were too tired to care. The guy at the front desk barely looked up when they walked in. His skin was pale, and his smile was off. "Room 6, he said, sliding them a rusty key. "No refunds." Inside, the room was worse than they expected. The wallpaper was curling at the edges, and the bed creaked when they sat down. But it was a bed, and that was all they needed. Lucy joked about how it looked like something out of a horror movie, but Sam just shrugged. "We'll be out of here by morning," he said. Around 1 a.m., Sam woke up to a strange noise. It was faint, like someone whispering in the next room. He sat up, listening, but it stopped. Thinking it was just his imagination, he lay back down. Then he heard it again, closer this time. Lucy stirred beside him, mumbling something in her sleep. Sam nudged her. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She groggily shook her head. "It's probably just the pipes," she said, rolling over. But Sam wasn't so sure. The whispers didn't sound like pipes. They sounded like voices. Unable to shake the unease, he got up and peeked out the window. The parking lot was empty except for their car. But as he turned to go back to bed, he noticed something strange in the mirror. For just a second, he thought he saw someone standing behind him, a shadowy figure with no face. When he turned around, the room was empty. The next morning, Sam didn't say much. Lucy, on the other hand, looked exhausted. "I had the weirdest dreams," she said over the stale muffins they'd grabbed from the lobby. "I kept seeing people in the room, just staring at us. It felt so real." Sam decided not to mention what he'd seen in the mirror. They checked out as quickly as they could and hit the road, but something felt off. The road signs didn't make sense. They'd been driving for hours, but they kept passing the same landmarks: a rusted gas station, a broken-down truck, and a dead tree with vultures perched on it. By the time they realized they were going in circles, the sun was setting. Lucy pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. "We need to find a place to stay," she said, her voice shaking. And then, as if on cue, the motel appeared again. The same flickering sign, the same cracked parking lot. This can't be," Sam whispered. They didn't want to stop, but they didn't have much of a choice. The gas gauge was hovering on empty, and the darkness seemed to press in on them. Reluctantly, they pulled into the lot and walked into the lobby. To their horror, the same man was behind the desk. "You again?" he said, his smile widening unnaturally. Lucy grabbed Sam's arm. "Let's just leave," she whispered. But the man shook his head. "Oh, you're not leaving." "Not yet." He slid the same rusty key across the counter. "Room 6. They didn't argue. The hallways felt longer this time, and the air was colder, heavy with the scent of mildew. When they reached room 6, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room looked the same as before, but something felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse, and the shadows moved even when there was no light. Lucy refused to sleep, sitting on the edge of the bed with her arms wrapped around herself. Sam tried to act calm, but he was just as terrified. The whispers started again, louder this time, and now they were coming from inside the room. The bathroom door slowly creaked open, and Sam grabbed a lamp, ready to swing. But there was nothing there. Just the mirror over the sink, fogged up like someone had been breathing on it. Written in the condensation were the words, "You never left." Lucy screamed, and the lights flickered out. In the darkness, they could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the bed. Sam fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight, but it didn't help. The beam cut through the dark, but the room didn't feel any brighter. When the lights came back on, they weren't alone. Figures stood around the room, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Sam and Lucy clung to each other, too scared to breathe. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with long, tangled hair. Her mouth opened, but her voice didn't match. It was deep, guttural, and full of malice. Why did you come back?" she hissed. Lucy burst into tears, shaking her head. "We didn't mean to," she sobbed. The woman tilted her head, her face twisting into something inhuman. "You don't leave this place," she said. "You just think you do." As she spoke, the room began to change. The walls faded, replaced by endless darkness. The bed disappeared, and they were left standing on a cold, hard floor. Sam and Lucy found themselves in a hallway that stretched forever. Doors lined the walls, each one identical, each one slightly ajar. From behind them came whispers and faint laughter, growing louder with each passing second. Lucy grabbed Sam's hand. "We have to move," she said, her voice trembling. They started running, but the hallway didn't end. No matter how far they went, the doors kept coming. And behind them, the laughter turned into screams. Finally, they stopped in front of a door that was different. It was old and wooden, with a single word carved into it, "Escape." Without thinking, Sam pushed it open, and they stepped through into blinding light. For a moment, they thought they were safe. They were back in their car, parked in the motel lot. The sun was rising, and everything looked normal. Lucy laughed, though it was more out of relief than joy. "Let's get out of here," she said. But as they drove away, Sam noticed something strange. The radio wasn't working, just static. And when he looked in the rearview mirror, the motel was still there, even though they'd driven miles. "It's following us," he whispered. Lucy didn't respond. When he glanced over, her eyes were blank, staring straight ahead. "Lucy," he said, his voice rising. But she didn't answer. Slowly, she turned to him, and he saw her reflection in the mirror. It wasn't her face anymore. The car swerved off the road, crashing into a ditch. Sam stumbled out, coughing and bleeding, but Lucy was gone. The car was empty, the driver's side door hanging open. He called out for her, but the only response was his own echo. That's when he saw it, the motel. It was right in front of him, even though he'd just left it miles behind. The sign flickered, and the whispers started again, louder this time. Sam fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the laughter echoed all around him. The door to room 6 swung open, and he saw Lucy standing there, her face twisted into a cruel smile. "You should have stayed," she said, her voice not her own. "Now you'll never leave." No one ever saw Sam or Lucy again. Their car was found abandoned, miles from the nearest town, but there was no sign of them. The motel? It's still there, but no one dares to stay the night. Some say it's a trap, a place that preys on travelers who lose their way. Others think it's a gateway to something worse, a pocket of reality where time and space collapse. All I know is this: if you're ever driving through the back roads of Texas and see a flickering vacancy sign, don't stop. Because once you check in, you're never really gone. You know New York, right? The city that never sleeps. It's alive 24/7, always bustling, always noisy. But something's been happening lately. I didn't notice it at first, not until the oddities started piling up. It's hard to put into words, but the nights feel different. There's a quietness that wasn't there before. At first, it was just little things. I'd go out after dark, and the streets would be emptier than usual. I mean, sure, it's New York, there's always someone around, right? But I started noticing that, around midnight, the city seemed to clear out. Like people just disappeared. The usual street vendors, the late-night runners, even the homeless folks that normally line the sidewalks, they were gone. One night, I found myself walking down Fifth Avenue around 2 a.m. Everything was still. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps against the pavement. And then, just as I passed a dimly lit alley, I saw them. Figures, standing perfectly still. Tall, thin shadows that didn't move even when I stared right at them. It was like they didn't even notice me, like they weren't part of the world anymore. The next few nights, I couldn't stop thinking about those figures. They were always there, standing at the edge of my vision, lurking in alleyways, sometimes just at the corners of streets. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe I was just too tired. But every time I went out, the city seemed emptier. More silent. I started noticing that the streets were even more deserted after sunset. It was like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, when I'd walk past those figures again, I realized something even stranger. There were no footprints. No sign of their existence at all. They were just there. 1 second, and gone the next. No tracks, no marks on the pavement. The worst part? One of them followed me. I wasn't sure at first, but I could feel it. I'd turn a corner, and there it was, just standing, as if it had been waiting. And when I turned to face it, it didn't move. I tried walking faster, but the thing stayed in my peripheral vision, always there, no matter how fast I went. I started getting paranoid. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? People would think I was losing it, or worse, they'd think I was just another one of the crazy folks in this city. But it wasn't just me noticing anymore. My friends started asking if I'd been out late recently. "It's like the city's changing," one of them said, her voice shaky. "Have you noticed how weird it is after dark?" I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the isolation that comes with living in a city of millions. But something wasn't right. Every time I went outside after sunset, I'd see more of them, those silent figures standing like statues, not even flinching when I passed by. I took a different route home one night, hoping to avoid them. But as I turned onto a new street, there they were again. Hundreds of them. All standing in a perfect line, staring straight ahead. I froze, my heart racing. They were all perfectly still, like mannequins in a display window. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. 1 second, they were there, the next, they were gone. No sound. No sign of where they went. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell the police. Who would believe a story like that? But it kept happening. Every night, the figures would appear, standing in silence on street corners or in alleys. They never made a sound, but I could feel their eyes on me. I started carrying a flashlight, shining it in the alleys where I saw them. But the light never reached them. It was like the darkness swallowed everything up around them. One night, I decided to follow one of them. I had to know what they were. As I crept behind one of them, my heartbeat echoing in my ears, it never turned to look at me. It didn't react to my presence at all. I kept my distance, watching it move through the shadows. The way it moved was wrong. There was no fluidity, no natural movement. It was like it was gliding, not walking, floating just above the ground. I followed it for what felt like miles. It led me through alleyways and side streets, into a part of the city I didn't recognize. The buildings here were crumbling, abandoned. No streetlights, no people. It was just me and that figure, floating ahead of me. And then, without warning, it stopped. I tried to step closer, but my foot caught on something. I looked down, and my stomach churned. I was standing on a fresh patch of wet concrete. But it wasn't just any concrete, it was moving. Slowly, the concrete began to ripple beneath my feet, like something was shifting underneath. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I could hear the figure ahead of me now, just beyond the darkness. A low hum, like a buzzing in my ears. It was calling me. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was anymore. All I knew was that I needed to get away from that thing, away from whatever was happening in this part of the city. But when I turned around to check if it was still following me, the streets had changed. The buildings, the signs, everything was distorted. Nothing looked familiar. The concrete had stopped moving, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I could hear the hum again, louder now, coming from all directions. And then, I saw them, more of them. Figures emerging from the shadows, gliding silently toward me. They had no faces. No features. Just blank, white masks that reflected nothing. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but time wasn't making sense anymore. I thought I was going crazy. The city was changing around me, bending in ways I couldn't understand. Every time I turned a corner, the streets twisted into something new. Everything was warped. And the figures, there were more of them now, always moving, always waiting. I made my way back to the main streets, but nothing was the same. The lights were dimmer, and the shops that used to be open at night were now locked, their windows dark. I looked up at the skyline. It was different too. Those familiar towering buildings were gone. In their place were monstrous structures, dark and looming, like they were growing out of the ground. I tried to find someone, anyone. But there was no one. The city that was supposed to be alive was now completely deserted. I realized I was completely alone in this distorted version of New York. And the worst part? The figures were closing in. There was nowhere left to run. That's when I started hearing their whispers. Low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the meaning, like it was crawling into my mind. You don't belong here. The voice, if you could even call it that, was cold and ancient, as though it had been around long before I ever stepped foot in this city. I ran again, but it was pointless. I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like they were getting closer. My legs burned with exhaustion, but no matter how fast I ran, the city kept stretching out, growing impossibly large and unfamiliar. Then, I reached the edge of the city. The buildings stopped, and there was just an endless, empty space. No roads, no signs of life, just a vast void. And at the edge of this abyss, standing alone in the dark, was the first figure I had ever seen. It was waiting for me. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. It was like the air itself had been sucked out of the city, leaving nothing but a suffocating silence. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me. And then, it spoke, not with words, but with a feeling, a force that pushed against my mind. You shouldn't have seen us, it said, its voice inside my head. You've crossed the line. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. The city, the real city, seemed so far away now. It was like I was standing on the edge of a dream. I tried to turn, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I could only stand there, paralyzed, as the city around me twisted into something even worse. I could hear them now, all of them. Hundreds of figures, all moving in unison, their silent steps echoing in the empty streets. They were circling me, trapping me in this nightmare. And I realized then, with chilling clarity, that I wasn't going to leave. Not ever. Days? Weeks? I don't know how much time passed. I couldn't escape. The figures were always there, surrounding me, their faceless stares burning into me. The whispers never stopped. They became louder, more insistent. I could feel my sanity slipping away, like the city itself was slowly swallowing me whole. I tried everything. I tried calling for help, but no sound left my mouth. I tried running again, but the streets stretched on forever. I was trapped in this distorted version of New York, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And then, one night, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the figures, it wasn't standing still. It was moving closer. Slowly, silently. And when it reached me, it didn't stop. It passed right through me, cold as ice, leaving a trail of deathly chill in its wake. That's the last I remember. After that, it all fades. I don't know if I'm still in the city or if I'm somewhere else now. I don't know if I'm alive or dead. All I know is that the figures are still there, waiting for someone else to see them, someone else to wander too far. The city is silent now, empty. The figures are still out there, waiting. And I don't think I'll ever leave. I'm not sure if I'm a part of this world anymore, but I know one thing. If you ever find yourself in New York, after the sun goes down, just remember this: don't look into the shadows. Don't follow the whispers. You might not make it out. So, listen up. I gotta tell you about this family I know. They moved into a farm, you know, the kind of place you see in those old movies, out in the middle of nowhere. They thought they'd get away from the noise and the mess of the city. They bought the land cheap. No one else was really interested in it. It seemed perfect, right? Quiet, peaceful, just what they needed after years of hectic city life. But from the moment they arrived, something felt off. They thought it was just the isolation, maybe the house itself was old and creaky, but there was something else. They started hearing strange sounds at night. Nothing obvious, just faint whispers carried on the wind. The parents brushed it off as just the sound of nature, wind rustling, animals, that sort of thing. But then they saw the marks. One day, the father was fixing the barn and found some odd symbols carved into the wood. They looked old, like they'd been there for years. At first, he thought it was just some weird design, maybe left by the previous owner. But as time went on, he started finding more of them. The symbols weren't just in the barn. They were on the trees, on the fences, even in the dirt. It started to feel like the whole property had been marked. It didn't take long for things to get even weirder. The kids, a boy and a girl, started seeing things at night. At first, it was just shadows moving across the fields, but the shapes, they weren't like anything they'd seen before. The shadows weren't natural, they seemed to shift, almost like they were alive. The boy swore he saw one of them darting behind the barn late one evening. He told his sister, but she just laughed it off. Kids, right? But the whispers didn't stop. Every night, they could hear them getting louder. It was like the wind was carrying voices, low, guttural, chanting. Sometimes, they would hear footsteps behind them when they walked through the field, but when they turned around, nothing was there. It was as if the land itself was watching them. Then came the night they saw the first real sign of something wrong. The father went out to check the fields, and when he returned, he was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He said he'd found something. He didn't say much more, just that there was a mark in the field. When they all went to see it, they found a circle of burned earth. It was as if someone had intentionally scorched the ground, forming an eerie symbol in the center. The air around it felt thick, almost suffocating. They didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. The nights after that were the worst. The family started to hear things that weren't just the usual creaks and groans of an old farmhouse. The whispering voices grew louder, more distinct, and more persistent. Sometimes they'd wake up in the middle of the night, and the house would be completely still, except for the whispers, right outside their windows. The kids swore they saw faces pressed against the glass, just out of view. Then, one night, the mother woke up to find the barn door wide open, and the smell of something foul hanging in the air. She went out to close it, but the moment she stepped inside, she froze. There, on the floor, were strange objects, bones, scattered in a circle, with more symbols drawn in blood around them. She backed out slowly, her heart pounding. This wasn't just some weird coincidence anymore. They weren't alone. The family didn't know what to do. They called the local sheriff, but when he came out, he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably some prank from the nearby town kids. But the family wasn't buying it. They knew what they were hearing, what they were seeing. It wasn't just some joke. And that night, something happened that made them realize just how deep they were in. When the whole family went to bed, they found their doors wide open in the morning. The wind hadn't blown them open. Something, or someone, had let themselves in. It only got worse from there. The whispers continued, but now, they were joined by other sounds, scratching, like something was trying to get in through the walls. One night, the father decided he couldn't take it anymore. He stayed up all night, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was causing the noise. By morning, he was a wreck. He claimed he saw things. Moving shapes, crawling along the walls of the house, like they were trying to get in. The family began to avoid the fields entirely. They'd seen too much by then. But one evening, the boy couldn't help himself. He went out to play in the yard, trying to forget about the creeping fear that had taken over. As he played, he noticed something in the distance, figures standing still out in the field, just beyond the trees. They were too far away to make out clearly, but they were unmistakable. And then, just as suddenly as he saw them, they vanished. That night, the whispers were louder than ever. The family could hear them, coming from the field. They tried to ignore it, but then the daughter screamed. She was standing by the window, staring out into the night. She claimed she saw figures walking across the field, moving in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. Her eyes were wide with terror as she described them, tall, dark shapes, moving with purpose, like they were performing some kind of ceremony. The following days felt like a nightmare. The family was on edge, always looking over their shoulders, never sure if they were alone or if something was watching. The whispers continued, but now, they had a sense of urgency to them, like they were calling to them, beckoning them into the darkness. The children stopped playing outside, the mother stayed inside, and the father, well, he started to look for answers. One afternoon, the father went back into the field, determined to find out what was happening. He couldn't just sit around anymore, waiting for something to happen. But when he reached the center of the field, he found something that made his blood run cold. There, in the dirt, was a pile of old, rotting books. When he picked them up, the covers were covered in the same strange symbols he'd seen around the property. He started flipping through the pages, and that's when he found it, rituals. Dark, ancient rituals, designed to summon things from beyond. He didn't tell the family right away. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something far worse than just a haunted farm. That night, They heard something new, loud banging on the windows, followed by frantic scratching sounds, like claws on glass. The children huddled together in fear. The father went to check the windows, but when he opened the curtains, there was nothing there. Nothing except the faintest scent of decay, lingering in the air. Things took an even darker turn after that. The family was on edge, barely sleeping, always hearing the whispers, always seeing things moving in the shadows. One evening, the mother went out into the yard, hoping to catch some fresh air and clear her mind. But as soon as she stepped onto the grass, she froze. There, in the moonlight, was a figure standing at the edge of the field. A tall, thin figure, its face hidden in the shadows. She called out to it, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless. Slowly, it began to move, walking across the field, towards the barn. The mother's heart pounded in her chest as she watched it disappear into the dark. She knew something wasn't right, but when she went inside to tell the others, the house was silent. The family began to feel like they were being drawn into something they didn't understand. They kept hearing the whispers, growing louder, like the voices were speaking directly to them. One night, the boy woke up to the sound of something tapping on his window. When he looked out, he saw nothing but the darkness of the field. But the tapping didn't stop. It continued, rhythmic and persistent. The boy pulled the curtains aside, but there was no one there. It was then that he realized there was something in the field, something that had been waiting for them all along. By now, the family was completely terrified. They tried to leave, but the moment they packed up, they heard the voices again, louder, more frantic, urging them to stay. The whispers were no longer a background noise, they were a constant, creeping presence. No matter where they went, they felt like they were being watched. Even inside the house, they couldn't escape the sense of dread that filled the air. One night, the father went out again, determined to confront whatever was out there. He took a flashlight and went straight into the field, ignoring the warnings from the others. As he reached the spot where the burned earth circle had been, he froze. There, in the center of the circle, was a stone altar, covered in old bloodstains. The air was thick with a presence he couldn't describe, something ancient, something dark. And then, the whispers stopped. But just as he turned to leave, something grabbed his ankle. He screamed, but when he looked down, nothing was there. The grip tightened, pulling him toward the altar. He fought it, kicking and thrashing, but the force was too strong. It felt like the earth itself was trying to drag him under. When the father finally managed to break free, he stumbled back to the house, terrified. He couldn't explain what had happened, but he knew they couldn't stay there anymore. The family gathered their things, ready to leave, but the moment they tried to drive away, their car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died. The whispering voices returned, this time in a chorus, all calling their names, urging them to come back. The family refused. They begged, pleaded, but the car wouldn't budge. As the night grew darker, the atmosphere became suffocating, like something was closing in around them. They sat in the car, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, they thought it was over, but as they looked around, they saw something that made their blood freeze, figures standing in the field, just beyond the trees. They were no longer shadows. They were real. The family drove away, never looking back. But the whispers stayed with them. They couldn't escape them, no matter where they went. Every time they closed their eyes, they could hear them. And they knew they'd never be free from the farm. Years passed, but the memories never faded. The family eventually moved to a new place, far away from that cursed farm, but the nightmares continued. the whispers still followed them. The children, now grown, sometimes heard them when they were alone, whispering their names, calling them back to the land that had claimed so much from them. The father, still haunted by what he saw, tried to forget. But he couldn't. It was as if the farm had marked them, chosen them as its own. And no matter how far they ran, it would always find them. One night, the son went back. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see it again, to understand it. When he arrived at the farm, the land was silent. But as he stepped onto the property, the whispers began, low and urgent. He looked around, but no one was there. And then, in the distance, he saw them, the figures. He wasn't alone. It was supposed to be just another routine expedition. A team of 6 seasoned explorers, with years of Arctic experience between them, was sent to study the effects of climate change on the Alaskan wilderness. They were prepared for anything: blizzards, freezing temperatures, isolation, but nothing could have prepared them for what they stumbled upon. As they trekked through the harsh, frozen landscape, they found it. A forgotten settlement, abandoned for decades, its buildings almost completely buried under layers of snow. No signs of life. The houses were eerily still, their windows dark, but there was something off. Something in the air felt wrong. It was like the world itself was holding its breath. Curious, they ventured inside, each of them growing more uneasy the further they went. The place was like a snapshot of time, frozen in the late 1950s. Dusty furniture, old photographs, but no signs of any struggle or evacuation. It was as if the people had just vanished. There were no bodies, no signs of anyone having left in a hurry. Just silence. The first night at the settlement was unsettling. The wind howled outside, but inside, it was unnervingly calm. They set up camp in one of the cabins, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. That's when it started, soft, almost imperceptible scratching sounds coming from the walls. At first, they assumed it was just the old wood settling, but it grew louder, more frantic. John, the team leader, insisted it was just the cold playing tricks on them, but the rest of the group couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They tried to sleep, but the sounds continued, echoing through the walls like something, or someone, was trying to get in. The night dragged on, and just as they were about to dismiss it as nothing, one of the explorers, Lisa, found something strange. In the corner of the room, under a pile of old blankets, was a small, frozen diary. She opened it, and her hands shook as she read the first entry: "The dark has awoken. We are not alone." Her voice trembled as she whispered the words to the group. The next morning, they decided to investigate further. The settlement was large, with multiple cabins scattered across the area, and a communal hall at the center. They made their way to the hall, its doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. But there were no bodies, just remnants of life abandoned in haste. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved hastily into the wood, as if the settlers had been trying to ward something off. It looked like some kind of ritual, but it was unlike anything any of them had ever seen before. As they explored, they found more disturbing signs. Old journals, scribbled in a frantic hand, spoke of the coming darkness. Of things buried beneath the ice, waiting for the polar night to return. It was clear that whatever had happened here wasn't a simple evacuation. Something had driven these people to flee, or worse, something had taken them. That night, the group gathered around the fire in the main cabin, trying to make sense of everything they had found. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind outside howled like a living thing. John tried to keep everyone calm, but even he couldn't ignore the feeling of dread that was creeping in. The scratching sounds returned, louder now, as if whatever had been behind the walls was getting closer. The group froze, listening intently. It wasn't just the walls this time, it was coming from all around them. From the floorboards. From the ceiling. Suddenly, one of the explorers, Mark, screamed. The others rushed to him, only to find him standing motionless, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed toward the window, his voice barely a whisper. "It's them, they're back." They looked outside, but all they saw was the swirling, blinding snow. Nothing was there, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The next day, they discovered the source of the scratching. In the basement of the communal hall, they found a hidden door, half covered in snow. When they opened it, the air inside was freezing cold, far colder than outside. The room was small and dark, with piles of old, rotting clothing scattered around. But what caught their attention were the walls. Every inch was covered in claw marks, as if something had been trying to escape. That's when they found the first body. It wasn't frozen like the others, it was unnaturally dry, like it had been drained of life. Its eyes were wide open, frozen in a silent scream, and its skin had a pale, bluish tint. The group backed away, horrified. Whatever had happened here wasn't just an evacuation, it was a massacre. And whatever had done this was still out there, still waiting. By now, the group was on edge, but they couldn't leave. The storm had intensified, and with the polar night approaching, the sun wouldn't rise again for weeks. They were trapped in this cursed place, and every night, the whispers grew louder. The wind outside now seemed to carry a voice, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the snow and ice. That night, Lisa had a nightmare. In it, the settlers were calling to her, urging her to come to them. "We're waiting," they whispered. "Come join us." She awoke in a cold sweat, heart racing, and when she looked out the window, she saw them, figures, moving just beyond the trees. She blinked, and they were gone. The next morning, Lisa was gone, too. There was no sign of her in the cabin. The door was wide open, the snow outside undisturbed. The group searched frantically, but there was no trace. Just the lingering sense that something had taken her, something old, something that had been waiting. Desperation set in. With each passing day, the group grew weaker, more paranoid. The cold seemed to seep into their bones, and the whispers never stopped. They could hear them even in the daylight, growing louder as the sun remained absent. Whatever was here, it was feeding on their fear. John and Mark decided to venture back to the basement, hoping to find something that could explain what was happening. They didn't want to believe it, but the signs were clear. The settlers hadn't just vanished, they had been sacrificed. And now, the settlement was alive, feeding off the darkness that surrounded them. When they returned to the basement, they found something that made their blood run cold. The walls, which had once been covered in claw marks, now displayed something far worse, symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. The symbols were moving, shifting, as if they were alive. And at the center of the room, something stirred. The thing that stirred in the basement wasn't human. It was a mass of shadows and ice, its form constantly shifting, like it was trying to take shape. It whispered in a voice that wasn't quite human, but still somehow familiar. "Join us," it hissed. "The night is eternal. You are mine." The group backed away in terror, but there was nowhere to run. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. They could feel the temperature drop even further, and the air grew thick with something oppressive, like the darkness itself was choking them. The shadows began to move, swirling around them, pulling at their limbs, making them stumble. John tried to fight back, but it was useless. One by one, they were consumed, drawn into the dark mass. The last thing John saw before everything went black was the glowing eyes of the creature, watching him as he was pulled into the abyss. When the storm finally passed, the search team that came looking for them found the settlement in ruins. There were no bodies, no sign of the expedition. Only the frozen remains of the settlement, its buildings covered in thick layers of ice. The ground was unnaturally cold, colder than it should have been. And in the center of the settlement, they found something strange, a pile of bones, arranged in a ritualistic pattern. The search team left quickly, but they never spoke of what they had found. The settlement, they said, was cursed. It was a place where the darkness lived, waiting for the long polar nights to return. No one ever dared to go back. And as the years passed, the memory of the expedition faded, but the whispers never stopped. They were still out there, waiting for the next group of curious souls to stumble upon the forgotten settlement. As the years went by, the settlement was slowly forgotten, buried under the relentless snow and ice. But in the long polar night, when the world is dark and still, some say they can still hear the whispers. They say that if you listen closely enough, you can hear the voices of the lost explorers, calling out from the frozen ground, begging to be released. And if you're foolish enough to answer, you might find yourself joining them, trapped in the ice, forever waiting for the dawn that will never come. It started like any other bus ride. A group of strangers, all silently lost in their own thoughts, boarded the bus at a small, dimly lit station. The bus was nearly empty, except for a few people scattered here and there, eyes glued to their phones or out the windows, barely paying attention to the road ahead. The night was thick with fog, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engine as the driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, pulled away from the curb. No one paid much attention to the route. They figured it was just another trip, another night. But as the bus rolled on, something felt wrong. The landscape outside seemed to blur, like the road was stretching on forever. The trees and buildings outside had no distinct shape, just dark shadows against the even darker sky. It was as if the world was slipping away, but the bus kept moving, inching forward into the void. And then the whispers started. At first, it was just a faint sound, like someone talking in the back of the bus. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they filled the entire space. The passengers turned to look at each other, confusion written across their faces. But no one spoke up. It was like the fear had already settled in, crawling into their minds without them even realizing. The first person to react was an older woman sitting near the front. She started muttering to herself, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. "I've seen this before," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I've seen this road. It doesn't end. It never ends." Her eyes darted around the bus, wide and fearful, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. A young man, probably in his 20s, snorted nervously. "It's just a bad dream, lady. We'll be there soon." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. He looked out the window, and his face went pale. The road, which had been stretching on endlessly, seemed to be repeating itself. The same twisted trees, the same dark sky, the same stretch of highway. No matter how far they drove, it felt like they were stuck in a loop. The bus driver remained eerily silent, his hands steady on the wheel, as if he was guiding them along this endless path. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the growing tension in the air. The other passengers sat quietly, some fidgeting nervously, others staring blankly ahead, as if the weight of the situation was too much to comprehend. But with every passing minute, the pressure mounted. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. The road ahead was no longer just a road. It was a prison. As the hours dragged on, the atmosphere inside the bus grew heavier. The temperature dropped, and the windows began to fog up, despite the air conditioning running. People began to notice strange things about each other. A woman, sitting across from a man, started to whisper softly to herself, her voice barely audible. At first, it sounded like she was praying, but then her words twisted into something darker, something personal. I didn't mean to, she kept repeating, her eyes wild with fear. The man across from her shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His fingers clenched around the edge of his seat, his knuckles white. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at something else, something just out of sight. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out an old photograph. It was crumpled, worn, and faded with time, but his eyes locked onto it as if it was the only thing keeping him from going insane. The whispers grew louder, the words now clearer, piercing through the growing tension in the bus. Everyone was hearing them now, voices from the past, regrets, fears, long-lost memories they didn't want to remember. And it wasn't just the passengers who were affected. The bus itself seemed to be alive, breathing in the darkness, feeding off their fear. Each mile stretched on like a nightmare with no end in sight. By now, panic was starting to set in. Some of the passengers tried to speak up, asking the driver to stop or to turn around, but he never responded. His face remained expressionless, and his hands never wavered on the wheel. "We can't stop," he muttered, just loud enough for one of the passengers to hear. "We can't go back. There's nowhere to go." The bus continued its journey into the darkness, the world outside growing even more surreal. The landscape had become a twisted version of itself. Shadows seemed to move and twist in the corners of the passengers' eyes. The trees outside no longer looked like trees, they were faces, contorted and screaming, their mouths gaping wide as if to swallow the bus whole. One by one, the passengers began to see their own fears come to life. The young man who had tried to calm the older woman earlier now found himself frozen in place, staring at his own reflection in the window. The reflection wasn't his, it was a face he recognized, but it wasn't his own. The face in the glass smiled back at him, a wicked grin spreading across its face as the bus continued to race forward. The woman near the front was no longer muttering. She was crying, her face twisted in agony as she clutched the side of her seat, her eyes wide with terror. "I've seen this," she sobbed. "I've seen all of this before. This is where it ends." No one knew what she was talking about, but as they looked around, they began to see it too. A black shape, crawling slowly across the bus floor, weaving between the seats, was now moving toward them. It was like a living shadow, its edges constantly shifting, as if it was made of pure darkness. The man with the photograph dropped it in horror, and the woman began to scream, her cries echoing through the cramped space. The bus didn't slow down. It couldn't. There was no stopping this ride. It felt like they were caught in a loop, doomed to repeat the same terrifying journey over and over. Every mile they traveled brought them closer to something they couldn't escape. The bus was no longer a mode of transport, it was a trap. As the minutes bled into hours, the passengers began to break. The young woman who had been sitting quietly at the back of the bus stood up suddenly, her face pale and empty. She didn't say a word, she just walked to the front of the bus, her footsteps echoing unnervingly. "Stop," she whispered to the driver, but her voice wasn't her own. It was deeper, darker, like something else had taken over her body. "Let us off." But the driver, still silent, didn't respond. The woman continued forward, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. She reached for the driver's shoulder, and as her fingers touched him, he jerked back, his face twisting in fear. The bus screeched to a halt, the sudden jolt throwing everyone forward. The doors opened. Outside, there was nothing but blackness, the same empty road stretching ahead into eternity. The woman stepped off, but as soon as she did, the bus began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, as if it was pulling away from her. Where did she go? Someone whispered, but no one had the courage to answer. The bus was once again moving, the faces of the passengers hollow with fear. The road outside remained unchanged, the same endless stretch of dark nothingness. Then it happened again. The man with the photograph, still clutching it tightly, saw the same face staring back at him from the window. Only this time, the face wasn't smiling, it was crying. Tears of blood slid down its face, and its eyes seemed to plead for help. He slammed the photograph against the window, but the face remained, grinning. "None of us are getting out," he muttered, his voice shaking. "This is where we all end." The others didn't say anything, but the terror in their eyes said it all. They were trapped, doomed to ride this endless road for eternity. The whispers came again, this time louder, more urgent. The passengers could hear their own voices among the voices of others. "Please," someone begged. "Please, let me off. I just want to go home." But the driver didn't listen. He couldn't. He was just as trapped as they were. And they all knew it. No matter what they did, they couldn't escape. They had all been here before, they realized, in some twisted memory they couldn't place. Each of them had seen this road before, felt the fear of the endless journey, but none of them had ever been able to get off. They were all stuck, locked in a nightmare that wouldn't end. The bus rolled on, each second stretching into eternity, the road never changing, the darkness never relenting. And in the back of the bus, the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic, as if urging them to remember something terrible. As the night dragged on, time became meaningless. The road stretched endlessly, no matter how far they drove. The landscape outside remained the same, dark, empty, and hostile. And with each passing mile, the passengers began to realize the truth: they weren't going anywhere. Some had started to speak, but their voices were hollow, their words fading before they could be heard. One by one, the people on the bus grew quieter. They stopped looking out the windows, stopped trying to understand. They were all sinking into the same dark place, the same horrifying realization: there was no escape. And then, a voice, low and steady, broke the silence. It was the driver, his voice a rasping whisper. "I warned you. This was never meant to be a journey." The bus continued to move, but no one cared anymore. The faces of the passengers had become mere reflections in the glass, their expressions empty and void of emotion. They weren't alive anymore, not in any real sense. They had crossed over, and the road was their eternity. The driver turned once more, his face now just a shadow in the darkness. "There's no way back. This is where we end." And with that, the road stretched on forever, into nothingness. The bus and its passengers vanished into the endless night, never to be seen again. It all started on a quiet Thursday evening in a small town in Colorado. People had been noticing strange things for a while: lights flickering, shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, and an uneasy tension in the air. But it wasn't until the first person disappeared that things started to feel off. A young woman, Sarah, had been walking home from work. She never made it. No one heard anything, no screams, no cries for help. It was like she vanished into thin air. At first, the police thought it was just some sort of accident, maybe a runaway or someone who decided to disappear. But as more people started going missing, it became impossible to ignore. People were vanishing at night, and the town was growing more and more fearful. Rumors started circulating that the disappearances were connected to the strange, inexplicable events happening around town. Local businesses were losing customers, and the streets became emptier as the nights grew darker. The local journalist, Tom Granger, was the first to really start digging into it. He was a skeptic, never one to believe in conspiracy theories or supernatural nonsense. But when his own neighbor disappeared without a trace, he decided to investigate. He started asking questions, interviewing the families of the missing, and visiting the places where they were last seen. But every time he tried to get close, it felt like something was watching him, keeping him from getting too far into the truth. Tom's investigation led him to an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, but there was something about it that felt different now. The closer he got, the more uneasy he became. The house wasn't just abandoned, it felt like it was alive, as if something inside was waiting. Tom had heard the rumors, of course, people whispered that strange things happened there. But Tom was a journalist, not a believer in fairy tales. He was determined to uncover the truth. He stood outside for a moment, staring up at the decaying building. It looked like something straight out of a nightmare, windows darkened with grime, a porch that sagged under the weight of time, and the overgrown lawn that seemed to swallow everything around it. There was no sign of life, but Tom's gut told him there was something wrong. He pushed open the rusted gate and made his way toward the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open with a force that made Tom jump. Inside, the air was thick, musty, and stale, like it had been trapped here for years. The silence was deafening. As he stepped further into the house, he noticed strange symbols scratched into the walls, their meaning unclear but chilling. And then, just as he was about to turn and leave, he heard something, a whisper. It wasn't a voice, not really, but more of a sound that didn't belong. It was as if the house itself was speaking, warning him to leave. But Tom didn't listen. The more Tom dug, the more he started to connect the dots. The disappearances, the strange house, the growing feeling of dread that had taken over the town, there was something bigger at play here. He found old town records that spoke of eerie events going back decades, maybe even longer. The house wasn't just abandoned, it had been the home of a family that had mysteriously vanished years ago, right around the time the strange occurrences had started. The townspeople had never spoken about it, but Tom had uncovered enough to know something was deeply wrong. As he continued his search, Tom began to feel like he was being followed. He'd hear footsteps behind him when there was no one around, or see shadows flicker at the edge of his vision. The more he looked into the history of the house, the more certain he became that whatever had happened to the family wasn't just a disappearance, it was something worse. The whispers had become louder, and now Tom could almost hear them clearly, like voices calling to him in the dead of night. They were coming from the house, from the walls, from the earth itself. One evening, Tom decided to confront the source of the whispers. He knew he was risking everything, but he couldn't stop now. He went back to the house, this time armed with a flashlight and a notebook, determined to get to the bottom of it. As he stepped inside, the air felt thicker than ever before, and he could almost feel the weight of the eyes that were watching him. He made his way to the basement, where he believed the answers lay. But when he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the center of the room, was something he could never have prepared for. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he saw the figure standing in the middle of the basement. It was tall, too tall, and its body seemed to twist and writhe in ways that didn't seem natural. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The thing didn't speak, but Tom felt its presence, its gaze piercing into him like it was reading every thought in his mind. He backed up slowly, his legs trembling beneath him, but the creature didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for him to make a move, to say something, anything. Tom's heart raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. This wasn't some ghost or supernatural entity, this was something far worse. It was alive, and it had been living here, hiding in plain sight, for who knows how long. The more Tom stared, the more he realized that this creature wasn't the only one. It was a part of something larger, something much darker. Tom's mind raced as he pieced everything together. The disappearances weren't random, they were sacrifices. The creature, and others like it, had been feeding on the townspeople for years, hiding beneath the surface of the town, undetected. And now, Tom realized, it was too late for him to turn back. Whatever he had uncovered was too dangerous, too horrifying to expose. But as he turned to run, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Tom didn't have much time to think. The air in the basement grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in around him. He could hear the thing moving, its steps silent but deliberate, as if it were closing in on him. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices all urging him to leave, to escape while he still could. But it was too late. He was trapped. The thing was fast, and before he could even react, it lunged at him, its long, skeletal hands wrapping around his throat. The next morning, the town woke up to find Tom missing. His car was still parked outside his apartment, but there was no sign of him. The police launched a search, but after days of combing through the town, they found nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished. People started to whisper again, this time with more certainty. They all knew the truth now. Tom had learned too much, and the creatures that lived in their town weren't going to let anyone stop them. A week passed, and the town seemed to be holding its breath. People avoided talking about Tom's disappearance, but the whispers persisted, swirling around every corner. As the tension grew, another person vanished. This time, it was a child. A little girl named Emily, who had been playing outside when she disappeared without a trace. It wasn't long before more people started to vanish again, each disappearance more terrifying than the last. The townspeople were on edge, but they were too afraid to speak out, too afraid to confront what was happening. The creatures had them in their grip, and no one knew how to break free. Some tried to leave, but every attempt was met with failure. It was as if the town itself was trapping them, pulling them back no matter how far they ran. No one was safe. Everyone was a potential target. The creatures knew no bounds, and they would stop at nothing to claim more victims. Meanwhile, the creature that had attacked Tom lingered in the shadows, watching the town from afar. It knew the time was coming, that the town's secret was close to being exposed. But it didn't care. The fear was enough to sustain it, and as long as the whispers continued, it would keep feeding. And so, the town of Colorado remained a place of nightmares, trapped in an endless cycle of fear, until no one was left to tell the tale. The journalist, Jake, could feel the hairs on his neck stand up as he passed the houses of those he knew. Their empty windows stared back at him, almost as if watching his every move. The more he thought about the people who had disappeared, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The authorities had written off the disappearances as random, blaming them on hiking accidents or people leaving without telling anyone. But Jake knew better. Late one night, he decided to venture deeper into the woods just outside the town. He had heard rumors from an old woman at the diner, who whispered about things lurking in the shadows. "They walk among us," she had said cryptically, "but they aren't like us." Jake couldn't shake her words from his mind as he trudged through the thick underbrush, his flashlight cutting through the dense fog. He could sense something watching him, and it made his skin crawl. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered, and then went out completely. Jake cursed under his breath, fumbling in his pocket for extra batteries. As he replaced them, he heard a soft rustling nearby, followed by a low growl that made his heart race. He snapped his head in the direction of the sound, his breath caught in his throat. There was something out there, he wasn't alone. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he started moving quickly, heart hammering in his chest. The fog had thickened, and the path he had taken seemed to twist in unnatural ways, making it harder for him to find his bearings. The growl had stopped, but the feeling of being followed never left him. He knew that something was out there. He could feel it in his gut. Just as he was about to turn back, a shape emerged from the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light like two tiny, glowing embers. Jake froze, too terrified to move. The creature stood there for a moment, studying him, before taking a slow step forward. Jake stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. As he scrambled to his feet, he realized there were more of them, shapes moving silently in the mist, their presence suffocating. They were coming closer. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. What were they? How long had they been here? What did they want? Jake managed to break free from the fog for a few moments and ran back toward the town. He had to warn someone, anyone, about what he had seen. But when he reached the edge of the woods, something strange happened. The town looked different, darker, quieter, as if it had been swallowed whole by the night. He rushed toward the nearest house, banging on the door, but there was no answer. The streetlights flickered out one by one, leaving him in total darkness. The whole town was empty, as if it had been abandoned overnight. That's when Jake realized, these creatures had taken everything. They had taken the people. He had to get to the bottom of this, even if it cost him his life. As Jake stumbled through the town, searching for answers, he came across an old newspaper office. He had been there before, but now, something felt off. The door creaked open, and the stale air hit him like a punch to the gut. Inside, the desk was covered in papers, some yellowed with age, others fresh with ink. He pulled one closer to read it, and his stomach dropped. The paper detailed a long-forgotten history of the town, a history buried in blood and darkness. The first settlers had made a pact with something from the forest, something ancient, something not human. In exchange for their survival, they had to offer sacrifices. And those sacrifices, people, were never truly gone. They had become part of the creatures in the woods, their spirits forever twisted by the pact. Jake's heart sank as he realized the truth. The creatures weren't just beasts, they were the souls of the lost, the very people who had disappeared. And now, he was one step closer to becoming one of them. The creatures had found him, and they were closing in. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway, Las Vegas, the city of bright lights, endless entertainment, and, of course, casinos. I had been to a few before, but this place, the Mirage Casino, was something else. Massive, luxurious, and filled with the unmistakable hum of slot machines and the click-clack of dice hitting the tables. But something felt different about this one, almost wrong. I should have noticed it the second I stepped inside, but I was too caught up in the excitement. I sat down at a blackjack table, feeling the rush of the game. I wasn't a professional, but luck was on my side that night. I kept winning, the chips piling up in front of me. The dealer, a pale man with black eyes, gave me a faint smile every time I hit a lucky hand. I didn't think much of it, chalked it up to good fortune. But as I kept playing, the people around me started noticing. I heard whispers, and every now and then, someone would glance at me, their faces filled with envy or something darker. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, something happened. I won again. And again. The room seemed to grow quieter, the atmosphere thick with tension. A sudden, cold draft swept through the casino, and the lights flickered. The dealer's smile faded, replaced by something more sinister. His gaze seemed to linger on me longer than was normal, and that's when I felt it, the presence, something watching me from the shadows. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. I had made a lot of money the night before, more than I ever thought I could win. But instead of feeling elated, there was this gnawing unease in my stomach, like something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I decided to go back to the casino to cash in my winnings, but when I arrived, the atmosphere had changed. The air was thick, heavy, and the usual bright lights now seemed dimmer, as though they were struggling to stay on. As I walked through the casino floor, I noticed that the people I had seen the night before, those who had watched me win, were gone. The place felt emptier, almost like the crowd had disappeared overnight. I felt a pang of unease as I approached the counter, where the same pale dealer from last night was now standing. His black eyes met mine, and this time, there was no smile. Just a cold, empty stare. "Congratulations on your winnings," he said, his voice almost a whisper, as though it wasn't his voice at all. "But you should be careful. Some games don't play fair." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just some weird casino banter, but deep down, I felt like I was missing something. As I took my chips to the cashier, the feeling of dread grew stronger. The cashier, a woman with hollow eyes, looked at me as if she had seen me before, her face pale and gaunt, her hands trembling as she counted out my winnings. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she asked in a shaky voice. "One more than you should have. It's time to leave." I froze. The words sent a chill down my spine, and before I could ask her what she meant, she handed me my money and shoved me out of the line. "Go," she whispered, "before it's too late." I left the casino feeling more paranoid than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. I decided to head back to my hotel, but as I walked through the streets of Vegas, the world around me seemed to warp. The lights grew dimmer, the noise from the casinos grew muffled, and the faces of the people I passed began to look wrong. Hollow, vacant, like they were going through the motions without actually living. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what the cashier had said, "Before it's too late." I tried to rationalize it, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dealer's black eyes, the cold, dead stare of the cashier, and the faces of the people who had watched me win the night before. I tossed and turned in bed, finally deciding to head back to the casino once more. There had to be an explanation. I couldn't let it go. But when I arrived, the place was different. It looked like it had been abandoned. The lights flickered in a way that made the whole place seem alive, as though it was breathing. The slot machines were still running, but they were empty. No one was at the tables. And then I saw him, the dealer. He was standing in the same spot as before, his eyes locked onto mine with that same cold, calculating gaze. "I warned you," he said, his voice low and sinister. "You shouldn't have won." I tried to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the floor had turned to quicksand, pulling me deeper into the casino. The dealer slowly walked towards me, his form shifting in the dim light. He was no longer just a man, he was something else. Something dark, something ancient. "You're mine now," he said, his voice no longer human. "This casino is my domain, and anyone who wins too much belongs to me." I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The casino around me seemed to stretch and twist, as if it was alive, a monstrous entity that was feeding off my fear. I looked around, desperate for help, but all I saw were the shadows, shapes, figures that had no faces, no bodies. Just empty souls trapped in the walls of the casino. Suddenly, the dealer's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. "Welcome to your eternity," he whispered. And in that moment, I understood. The casino wasn't just a place to gamble, it was a trap. A place where souls were stolen, fed upon, and kept in the dark, forever bound to the demon that ruled it. As the dealer's cold grip tightened around my shoulder, I realized I was no longer in control of my own body. The casino had swallowed me whole. I tried to scream again, but it was as if my mouth was sealed shut. The lights above flickered more violently, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance around me. I could hear the faint whispering of countless voices, each one pleading for release, but their cries were muffled, lost in the dark corners of the casino. I turned my head to look around, and that's when I saw them. The other players. They weren't human anymore. Their eyes were wide and empty, their faces twisted in terror, frozen in place as they slowly shuffled around the casino, like lost souls bound to the demon's will. They had been like me once, lucky, winning big, but now they were part of the nightmare, forever trapped in the casino's grip. As I looked back at the dealer, his form seemed to grow larger, more monstrous, the shadows around him swirling and writhing like they were alive. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed. "Now you're mine, just like the others." Days, or maybe it was weeks, passed in that cursed place. Time no longer had any meaning. I had tried everything to escape, but every attempt only brought me deeper into the hellish labyrinth of the casino. I saw new faces, fresh victims who had walked into the trap, unaware of what awaited them. But it didn't matter. They were just like the others, their faces blank, their souls already claimed. The demon would approach them one by one, and I would watch, powerless, as they too were absorbed into the twisted world of the casino. It was like a sick game, and the dealer was the one pulling the strings, feeding off our fear, our souls. And then it hit me. The game was rigged from the start. We weren't supposed to win. Those who did were marked, chosen to be consumed by the demon. The casino wasn't a place of luck, it was a place of death. And now, there was no escape. I stopped fighting. There was no point anymore. The dealer had won. I had won too much, and now I was a part of the nightmare. The walls of the casino no longer looked like walls. They were alive, breathing, pulsating with the trapped souls of those who had lost their lives here. The laughter of the dealers, the whispering of the other players, it all blended together into a chorus of misery. The lights above flickered one last time before going out completely, leaving the casino in total darkness. But it didn't matter. I could still hear them, those empty souls, the whispers, the sinister laughter of the dealer, and the cold, knowing gaze of the demon who ran it all. I was just another pawn in his eternal game. And somewhere, deep within the casino, the demon waited for the next lucky soul to arrive, ready to feed. It was a cold, moonless night when Mark picked up his first passenger. The woman was dressed in all black, her face hidden beneath the hood of her coat. She climbed into the back of the taxi without a word, and Mark didn't think much of it. There were plenty of odd passengers in the city late at night. What caught his attention, though, was her destination, an abandoned factory at the edge of town. Nobody ever went there. It had been shut down for years, surrounded by whispers of ghost stories and urban legends. "Are you sure about that address?" Mark asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed out the window. The silence in the car was suffocating. Mark tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine, but something about her presence felt wrong. As the car turned onto the dimly lit street that led toward the factory, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew colder, the streets eerily empty. Even the hum of the city seemed to fade away. Mark glanced at his passenger again. Her eyes, when they met his, were empty, like she wasn't even there. The factory loomed ahead, its broken windows reflecting the pale light of the street lamps. Mark pulled up to the entrance, the woman still silent. She reached into her pocket and handed him a crisp bill, far more than the fare required. "Wait for me," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken since getting into the car. Mark wanted to refuse, but something about her voice kept him rooted to the spot. He watched her disappear into the shadows, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty night. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he nervously checked the time. Minutes ticked by, but she didn't return. A strange feeling washed over him, like he wasn't supposed to be there, like he was intruding on something he didn't understand. He had an overwhelming urge to leave, but his feet felt like they were glued to the pedals. Suddenly, the rearview mirror flickered. For a split second, he saw the woman again. Her face was different, distorted, her features warped like a nightmare. Mark blinked, and she was gone. He pulled his gaze from the mirror, heart racing. He had to get out of there. But just as he started the engine, the door opened. She was back. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and her skin had taken on an unnatural pallor. She didn't speak, just climbed into the back seat and closed the door behind her. Mark didn't know what to say, his throat tight with fear. What the hell was going on? "Where to now?" he finally asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Take me to the factory again," she said in a flat tone. Mark's mind raced. She had just been there. He couldn't understand why she would want to go back, especially with the way she looked now. But he found himself turning the wheel without question, the engine whining as the car rolled down the road again. The air felt even colder this time. The streets seemed to stretch on longer, the shadows growing darker with each passing moment. And when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. The woman had vanished. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. His hands were shaking as he turned around, but the seat was completely empty. Had he imagined her? But just as Mark started to doubt his own sanity, a soft knock came from the window. He nearly jumped out of his skin. When he looked to his left, the woman was standing there, her face now completely hidden by her hood. Her breath fogged up the glass as she stared at him. Mark, frozen in place, rolled down the window just a crack. "Please," she said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "take me back to the factory." The cold air rushed in, and Mark could feel a chill seep into his bones. There was something so wrong about her, like she wasn't human. His mouth was dry, but he found himself nodding, unable to refuse her. He drove again, but this time, the road seemed endless. The factory seemed further away, but he wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him or something darker. The shadows in the streets were growing longer, stretching toward him like hands reaching from the darkness. When he dared glance in the rearview mirror again, her eyes were glowing, an eerie light that sent chills down his spine. By the time they reached the factory for the third time, Mark was near panic. The car's headlights flickered, and the factory seemed to pulsate, as though it was alive. He stopped the car in front of the large iron gates, staring at the eerie building. It was as though the darkness itself was swallowing the light around him. The woman didn't say anything this time, just opened the door and got out. Mark's hands trembled as he watched her walk toward the entrance, her figure swallowed by the shadows of the building. He sat frozen in the car, a deep sense of dread gnawing at him. But then he heard it, the faintest whisper, almost like a chant. His heart pounded as the whispers grew louder. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out of there, but his body wouldn't obey. The air felt thick, and every breath he took felt heavier. It was as if the very atmosphere was alive, pressing against him. He turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. He was trapped. It was a cold, moonless night when Mark picked up his first passenger. The woman was dressed in all black, her face hidden beneath the hood of her coat. She climbed into the back of the taxi without a word, and Mark didn't think much of it. There were plenty of odd passengers in the city late at night. What caught his attention, though, was her destination, an abandoned factory at the edge of town. Nobody ever went there. It had been shut down for years, surrounded by whispers of ghost stories and urban legends. "Are you sure about that address?" Mark asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed out the window. The silence in the car was suffocating. Mark tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine, but something about her presence felt wrong. As the car turned onto the dimly lit street that led toward the factory, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew colder, the streets eerily empty. Even the hum of the city seemed to fade away. Mark glanced at his passenger again. Her eyes, when they met his, were empty, like she wasn't even there. The factory loomed ahead, its broken windows reflecting the pale light of the street lamps. Mark pulled up to the entrance, the woman still silent. She reached into her pocket and handed him a crisp bill, far more than the fare required. "Wait for me," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken since getting into the car. Mark wanted to refuse, but something about her voice kept him rooted to the spot. He watched her disappear into the shadows, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty night. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he nervously checked the time. Minutes ticked by, but she didn't return. A strange feeling washed over him, like he wasn't supposed to be there, like he was intruding on something he didn't understand. He had an overwhelming urge to leave, but his feet felt like they were glued to the pedals. Suddenly, the rearview mirror flickered. For a split second, he saw the woman again. Her face was different, distorted, her features warped like a nightmare. Mark blinked, and she was gone. He pulled his gaze from the mirror, heart racing. He had to get out of there. But just as he started the engine, the door opened. She was back. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and her skin had taken on an unnatural pallor. She didn't speak, just climbed into the back seat and closed the door behind her. Mark didn't know what to say, his throat tight with fear. What the hell was going on? "Where to now?" he finally asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Take me to the factory again," she said in a flat tone. Mark's mind raced. She had just been there. He couldn't understand why she would want to go back, especially with the way she looked now. But he found himself turning the wheel without question, the engine whining as the car rolled down the road again. The air felt even colder this time. The streets seemed to stretch on longer, the shadows growing darker with each passing moment. And when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. The woman had vanished. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. His hands were shaking as he turned around, but the seat was completely empty. Had he imagined her? But just as Mark started to doubt his own sanity, a soft knock came from the window. He nearly jumped out of his skin. When he looked to his left, the woman was standing there, her face now completely hidden by her hood. Her breath fogged up the glass as she stared at him. Mark, frozen in place, rolled down the window just a crack. "Please," she said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "take me back to the factory." The cold air rushed in, and Mark could feel a chill seep into his bones. There was something so wrong about her, like she wasn't human. His mouth was dry, but he found himself nodding, unable to refuse her. He drove again, but this time, the road seemed endless. The factory seemed further away, but he wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him or something darker. The shadows in the streets were growing longer, stretching toward him like hands reaching from the darkness. When he dared glance in the rearview mirror again, her eyes were glowing, an eerie light that sent chills down his spine. By the time they reached the factory for the third time, Mark was near panic. The car's headlights flickered, and the factory seemed to pulsate, as though it was alive. He stopped the car in front of the large iron gates, staring at the eerie building. It was as though the darkness itself was swallowing the light around him. The woman didn't say anything this time, just opened the door and got out. Mark's hands trembled as he watched her walk toward the entrance, her figure swallowed by the shadows of the building. He sat frozen in the car, a deep sense of dread gnawing at him. But then he heard it, the faintest whisper, almost like a chant. His heart pounded as the whispers grew louder. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out of there, but his body wouldn't obey. The air felt thick, and every breath he took felt heavier. It was as if the very atmosphere was alive, pressing against him. He turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. He was trapped. It started years ago, right after a storm hit the coast of California. The winds were violent, the sky an angry shade of gray, and the waves crashed against the cliffs like they were trying to swallow the world whole. But when the storm passed, something strange began to happen. Every time the weather cleared, ghost ships would appear just offshore. They weren't like the usual ships you'd see at sea. These were old, decaying vessels, their sails tattered, hulls rotting. No one knew where they came from or how they got there. The strange thing was that no one ever saw the crew. But there was always evidence. Logs, journals, even hand-drawn maps would wash up on the shore. In these journals, the sailors described the same eerie events, the distant sound of a bell tolling in the fog, shadows moving across the decks when no one was supposed to be there, and a creeping sense of dread that settled in like the fog itself. They spoke of voices in the wind, whispers that called to them, drawing them closer to the ships. The authorities didn't know what to make of it. They thought it was just a local legend at first, an old sailor's tale. But then, one by one, men went missing. Each one who ventured close to the ghost ships never returned, and the only thing left behind were those unsettling journal entries. One evening, a man named Thomas heard the stories, saw the wreckage, and thought he could do what the others couldn't. He was a seasoned sailor, used to navigating dangerous waters, but something about the ghost ships called to him. Maybe it was the promise of riches, or maybe it was just his curiosity. Either way, he set out on his own, determined to uncover the truth. The storm that night was worse than any of them had seen in years. Thomas didn't seem to care, though. He sailed his boat into the rough seas, ignoring the warnings from his fellow sailors, who all begged him to stay ashore. As the storm raged, he came across the first of the ghost ships, its dark silhouette barely visible against the stormy sky. Its sails hung limp in the windless air, and the creaking of the ship sounded like a whisper from the depths of the ocean. As Thomas approached, he felt a coldness creep over him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran down his spine. It wasn't the storm that made him nervous, it was the ship itself. The closer he got, the more the ship seemed to loom over him. And then, just as his boat came within reach, the sound of a bell rang out, low and mournful, followed by a whisper he couldn't make out. It wasn't until the next morning that anyone realized Thomas was missing. His boat had been found drifting aimlessly along the shore, the sails torn, and the hull scraped as if it had been dragged through jagged rocks. There was no sign of Thomas, just the empty boat and a strange, soggy journal lying in the cabin. Inside, the last few entries were written in a frantic, scrawled hand, describing his approach to the ghost ship, his encounters with strange, dark shapes on the deck, and the eerie whispers that seemed to fill the air. The final entry was chilling. "I don't know what they are," it read. "But they're coming for me. The shadows, they move like men, but they're not. And the bell, it's calling me." The journal ended there. No one knew if Thomas had been taken by whatever haunted the ship, or if he'd simply lost his mind in the midst of the storm. But what was clear was that he wasn't the first, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. For weeks after, the ghost ships continued to appear after every storm. And each time, a sailor would disappear. They would all leave behind the same kind of journal, the same warning. "The bell is calling," they'd write, just before vanishing forever. But no one knew where the bell came from or what it meant. The local town became filled with unease, and soon, no one dared approach the coast when the storm clouds gathered. People talked in hushed voices about the curse of the ghost ships, about the sailors who had been swallowed by the sea, and about the strange, haunting bell that echoed in the fog. They said the bell was cursed, that it called out to men like a siren, drawing them into the dark water where they were lost forever. It wasn't until a fisherman named Joe tried to put an end to it all that anyone dared to investigate. He wasn't like the others. Joe had been born on the sea, and he knew it better than anyone. He wasn't afraid of ghost stories. So, one stormy night, he sailed out alone, determined to end the mystery once and for all. He would find the source of the bell, he promised himself. As the storm approached, Joe's boat cut through the water like a knife. The sky above him was thick with black clouds, and the wind howled, but he pressed on. Then, just as he thought he saw something ahead, the fog rolled in, thicker than he had ever seen it. It swallowed the boat, and the faint sound of the bell reached his ears, so faint, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Joe's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed through the fog. The bell grew louder, its sound now a deep, resonating toll that shook the very air around him. His boat rocked violently as he got closer to the ghost ship. It was there, just as the others had described, an old, decaying vessel with no crew in sight. The ship seemed to be waiting for him, as if it knew he was coming. But Joe wasn't scared, not yet. He steered his boat closer, determined to figure out what was happening. The closer he got, the more the air around him seemed to chill. The fog thickened until he could barely see the bow of his boat. And then, just as he prepared to board the ship, something caught his eye, a figure standing at the railing. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and empty. The man's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Joe felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He reached out, but the figure vanished into the fog. In its place, the bell tolled again, louder this time, as if mocking his every move. Joe didn't hesitate. He boarded the ghost ship, his boots creaking on the decaying wooden planks. The ship was strangely silent now, save for the bell, which seemed to echo from somewhere deep within. He wandered through the ship, feeling like he was being watched, though he saw no one. The walls were covered in mildew, the ropes rotted away, and the sails were nothing more than tattered rags. It was as if the ship had been abandoned for centuries. But as he walked deeper into the ship, Joe found something strange, a journal, like the others. It was sitting on a table in the captain's quarters, its pages yellowed with age. As he opened it, the words were faded but still legible. The entries were nearly identical to the others: the strange ship, the eerie bell, the feeling of being watched. But then, the last entry stopped Joe cold. "The bell is the key," it said. "It controls them. It calls them, and they obey. I joined them. I am one of them now. They are coming for you, too." The journal ended there, and Joe's stomach dropped. He wasn't alone on the ship. Whatever had happened to the sailors before him was now happening to him. Joe's pulse quickened as the air around him grew colder. He looked around, trying to find a way off the ship, but the fog had thickened again, and the deck seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The bell tolled once more, and this time, Joe could hear footsteps. Faint at first, but growing louder, like they were coming for him. Suddenly, figures began to appear in the mist. Shadows, moving in the fog like ghosts, their forms indistinct but somehow familiar. They walked slowly, dragging their feet, and their faces were twisted in expressions of agony. Some were sailors, some were men who looked like they'd been lost for years. They all moved toward Joe, their hollow eyes staring through him. In a panic, Joe tried to run, but the shadows were closing in. The bell rang louder and louder, drowning out everything else, until all he could hear was the sound of it, the tolling growing stronger, more desperate. Joe stumbled, his heart racing, but he was trapped. The shadows surrounded him, their cold hands reaching out, pulling him into the mist. The next morning, the townspeople found Joe's boat drifting near the shore. There was no sign of him, just the boat and a journal, his journal, floating beside it. Inside, the final entry read, "I joined them. The bell calls. We are all its servants now. It wants you, too." The pages were soaked through, but the words were clear. Joe had become one of them, a ghost of the sea, lost to the fog. A few brave souls tried to investigate, but none returned. Every storm brought new ghost ships to the coast, and every time, they seemed to get closer. The townspeople could hear the bell ringing in the distance, its tolling like a death knell, echoing over the waves. No one dared approach the ships anymore. They knew better than to tempt fate. And so, the ghost ships continued to appear after each storm, their eerie bell tolling in the fog. Some say the ships are cursed, that they belong to a time long past, but no one really knows. What's certain is this: anyone who hears the bell, anyone who ventures too close, will never come back. They will vanish, leaving only their journals behind, warning the next person who dares to listen. Years passed, and the ghost ships became a part of the town's dark folklore. They were no longer just rumors or ghost stories told to scare the kids. The ships were real, and they were dangerous. Some of the older townsfolk even said they could hear the bell ringing in the distance, even when the weather was calm, the skies clear. They said the bell was always calling, that it never stopped. One night, a new man came to town. He was a sailor, like the others, and he had heard the stories. But instead of being frightened, he was intrigued. He was looking for adventure, something to give his life meaning. The locals warned him, but he laughed it off. The bell, the ghost ships, they were all just superstition, he thought. So, he set out to prove them wrong. That night, a storm rolled in, and the bell began to toll. The sailor sailed into the fog, and by the time the storm cleared, his boat had disappeared. There were no journals left behind, no sign of him. Just the tolling of the bell, growing louder, as if it had found another soul to claim. Years went by, and the town remained haunted by the ghost ships. No one knew when the bell would toll next, or when the ships would appear. The local fishermen, who had once ventured near the wrecks, had long since given up. It wasn't just the ghost ships they feared, it was the bell, that relentless, calling sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the ocean itself. Some nights, when the fog was thick, people swore they could hear it. The bell tolling in the distance, soft at first, then louder, as if it was drawing closer. It wasn't just a ship's bell, though. It was a warning. A reminder that the ships would always come back. That they would always call, looking for the next soul to take. And so the town remained, quiet, waiting for the next storm. Waiting for the ships to return. Waiting for the bell to toll once more. I was always drawn to the unknown, you know? The places people avoid, the things they pretend aren't there. That's what led me to Wyoming, to a remote part of the mountains no one really talks about. It wasn't on any maps. Local legends spoke of a tribe that lived there, a group so isolated from the world that even the government stopped trying to contact them. Some said they were primitives, others swore they were hiding something. When I first met them, I thought it was just like any other isolated group. They didn't speak much English, but their eyes told a story. It wasn't until the third night I spent with them that I started hearing things, strange sounds in the distance, like deep growls or distant roars that shook the earth beneath us. I chalked it up to the mountains. Strange noises, after all, are a part of nature. But the elders, they weren't so casual about it. I remember sitting with the chief one evening. He stared at the fire, his eyes hollow. "The ground is not our friend," he said. His words lingered in the cold night air like a warning. I didn't understand it at first, but I could tell the way his hand clenched around the stone knife at his belt, like it was a lifeline. That night, I heard the growl again, only this time, it was closer. As days passed, I grew more curious. The tribe had rituals, strange dances, and chants that seemed to hold deep meaning. The younger members of the tribe were eager to show me these customs, but they never fully explained why they did them. I found it odd, like they were trying to keep something hidden. One night, I followed a group of them into the forest, away from the camp. They were carrying torches, moving in a circle around a strange set of stones. I watched from the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest, as they began to chant in a language I couldn't understand. The ground beneath them started to tremble, and that same deep growl, like something waking from a long slumber, echoed through the air. The ground cracked, just for a moment, and I could see something ancient shifting beneath the earth. It was then I realized, this wasn't just a tribe. They were guarding something. When they finished the ritual, the growl faded, and the earth fell silent. I could see the fear in their eyes, especially in the elder's face as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "It is not the time yet," he muttered, as if talking to himself. But I heard him. He wasn't talking about the ritual. He was talking about something far worse. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening in those mountains. I tried to ask questions, but the tribe clammed up. The chief grew more distant, and the younger ones looked at me with a mix of curiosity and fear. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old cave, hidden in the forest, that I started to piece things together. Inside, there were drawings, carvings of creatures, half human, half beast, and symbols that made my skin crawl. The air inside was thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. Then, I found the part of the cave that made my blood run cold. There were bones, human and animal, arranged in a circle around a large, black stone. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and I had to fight the urge to run. But I didn't. I stayed, and that was my mistake. As soon as I touched the stone, the growl returned. This time, it was loud enough that the earth shook beneath me. I couldn't move. I felt like I was being watched, like something ancient, something terrible, was rising from the depths. The floor cracked open in front of me, and I saw eyes, thousands of them, glowing, deep within the earth. And that's when it hit me. The tribe wasn't just keeping the creature buried, they were feeding it. I ran. I didn't care about anything but getting out of that cave. I didn't even stop to look back, but I could hear the thundering roar behind me, growing louder with every step. By the time I got back to the tribe, everything had changed. They were preparing for something. I don't know what, but there was fear in their eyes. They had seen the look on my face, and I could tell they knew I had disturbed something. The chief caught me by the arm as I tried to leave the village, his grip cold and firm. "You have awoken it," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "You do not understand the danger. You've disturbed the balance." I didn't know what he meant, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. They were afraid. And I had just made it worse. That night, I tried to sleep, but the growl echoed again, louder than ever. It wasn't just the earth shaking now, it was the air itself, vibrating with something dark and malevolent. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I could feel it getting closer. The tribe had gathered, their chants growing louder, their movements more frantic. They were trying to keep it at bay, but it wasn't enough. As the days dragged on, the ground continued to shake. I started seeing things, shadows that didn't belong, creatures that moved just out of the corner of my eye. The tribe had sealed themselves inside their huts, not daring to venture out, but I could hear their whispers through the thin walls. They were afraid, more afraid than I had ever seen anyone before. And they kept talking about the ritual, about how the creature couldn't be stopped, only contained. One night, I ventured out again, determined to learn the truth. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something was pushing me forward. The ground was colder than usual, and the fog was thick, like the mountains themselves were trying to hide the truth. I followed the sound of the chanting, deeper into the forest, until I reached the stone circle again. The sky had turned dark, and the stars were swallowed by the thick fog. The tribe wasn't there. But something was. The air was thick with heat, and I could hear the growl, so close now. I stepped into the center of the circle, and that's when I saw it. There, beneath the ground, its eyes glowing, was the creature. It was huge, its body writhing in the earth like it was struggling to break free. It was trying to call me to it, to pull me down into the depths with it. I didn't know how I managed to pull myself away, but I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, back to the tribe, back to what I thought was safety. But when I got there, everything had changed. The people weren't gathered around the fire anymore. The huts were empty, the silence deafening. It was like they had all just vanished. I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck, and I spun around. There, standing in the shadows, was the chief. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "It's too late," he whispered. "You've awakened it." "You've broken the seal." His voice trembled, like he was fighting the panic rising in his chest. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. The rituals, the carvings, the constant fear, it wasn't just superstition. The tribe had been keeping something buried, something ancient, something that had been slumbering for centuries. And now, because of me, it was awake. I tried to ask him what to do, how to stop it. But the chief only shook his head, his eyes filled with despair. "There is no stopping it now. We must prepare for the end." His words were like ice, sinking deep into my bones. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he spoke, the way his hands trembled, it was clear that he had given up. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and the sound of the growl grew louder, so loud I thought my skull would crack under the pressure. The chief looked at me one last time, and then he turned, walking slowly toward the stone circle in the distance. I followed, unable to stop myself. When we reached the circle, I saw it. The creature, its massive form partially risen from the earth, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. The ground beneath it was cracked wide open, and I could feel the heat radiating from the deep fissures. The chief raised his arms, his voice chanting in that strange language, but it was too late. The seal had been broken, and the creature was free. The earth trembled beneath our feet, and I could hear the bones of the mountain cracking. The creature was rising, its massive body pushing through the ground, its tendrils reaching toward the sky. I didn't know how to stop it, but I knew I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed a torch from the ground and threw it at the black stone in the center of the circle. For a moment, everything went still. The air thickened, and the creature's eyes flashed with fury. I could hear its voice now, a low, rumbling growl, like it was speaking directly into my mind. It wanted to take me, to drag me down into the depths where it had come from. I turned to run, but the ground split beneath me. I fell, tumbling into the darkness. I felt something cold wrap around me, pulling me deeper, and I screamed. But my voice was swallowed by the earth, lost to the creature that had been waiting for me. I don't know how much time passed, but when I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else. The darkness around me was thick, suffocating. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like I was being held down by invisible forces. I heard voices, faint whispers echoing in the dark, but they weren't human. They were something else. Then I saw it. The creature, its massive eyes staring at me, burning with an otherworldly hunger. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was trapped, and there was no escape. The ground shook again, and I could feel it, it was coming closer. The creature had me. It had claimed me. And that's where I am now. Trapped in the depths of the earth, with nothing but the growls of the creature echoing around me. The voices, the whispers, they never stop. The tribe is gone, consumed by the very thing they had tried to keep buried for centuries. And now, it's my turn. I don't know if anyone will ever find this, but if you do, heed my warning. Don't go looking for things you don't understand. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some things are better left undisturbed. Because once you awaken them, there's no going back. And once they find you, there's nowhere to hide.